He was a student who dreamed of a career in law.
She was going into criminal justice and ultimately wanted to become a lawyer.
He was an old flame that always got her heart racing.
They're friends with benefits.
Together, they reconnected in a way neither expected.
She was pregnant with this child. There was nothing that was planned.
She was getting together with the father of her child. She was very happy.
But a few short weeks shy of her due date,
get out of the car!
A shocking abduction sent their fiery romance up in flames.
Get in there!
She feels lighter fluid being doused all over her, and then hears a striking of a match.
Next thing she knew, she was on fire, and she hears 2 gunshots. She feels a pain. She knows she's been shot.
In order to capture the assailant, police must enter a sweltering hothouse of lies, deceit, and unspeakable betrayal.
Ma, I've been kidnapped.
Who would ever contemplate harming a pregnant woman? Why would somebody do this in such cold blood?
May 26, 2012, Detroit, Michigan. In the early morning darkness, a frightened 22-year-old woman is fighting for her life. 9 months pregnant, LaTanya Bowman is engulfed in flames. Her first instinct is to try and extinguish the blaze, but as the fire consumes her, LaTanya remains motionless.
She was abducted, bound with duct tape, set on fire, and she heard 2 gunshots. Knowing that she was injured, possibly shot, she made the decision to play dead in an attempt to save her life and the life of her unborn child.
LaTanya's plan works. Believing she is dead, the monster responsible for this crime flees on foot. When the coast is clear, LaTanya puts out the fire and slowly crawls toward her car.
She's gone into survival mode. This guy leaves the keys in the vehicle. She realizes that and she jumps into the vehicle.
Despite her life-threatening injuries, LaTanya somehow finds her way to the home she shares with her mother.
Oh my God, what happened to you? Let's go to the hospital, move over.
As LaTanya is rushed into the emergency room, doctors are shocked by the severity of her wounds.
And she's got 2nd and 3rd degree burns, and she's shot. She is very seriously injured.
They weren't sure if she was going to survive, if the child was going to survive.
Hospital personnel contacts police and inform them there's been a crime. One so gruesome it turns the stomachs of even the most calloused investigators.
When it rises to the level where it makes a detective sort of raise his eyebrows, it's unusual. And this one was brutal.
Overnight, LaTanya's harrowing ordeal makes headlines across the country. Local police are feeling the heat. They need to solve this crime and solve it fast. But as investigators race to piece together the puzzle, an unimaginable picture begins to emerge. One of pure evil and a sucker punch expectant mother LaTanya Bowman never saw coming.
We think we've seen it all, but we're always amazed by what humans are capable of doing to another human.
Growing up in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, LaTanya Bowman knew early on what she wanted to do with her life.
She was studying criminal justice in school.
Well, she had that sort of vibrance about her. You know, she was young and hopeful, and, you know, she wasn't somebody out there that was working the streets.
A dedicated and popular student, by the time LaTanya turned 21, she was well on her way to fulfilling her dreams. She was a senior at a local community college and was on track to graduate ahead of schedule.
She had the whole world ahead of her. She was a hardworking college student and very dedicated to excelling.
And among her legion of friends, there was no one LaTanya enjoyed sharing her hopes and ambitions with more than close friend Jamal Rogers. LaTanya and Jamal had been tight since they first met in high school, nearly 6 years earlier.
Not bad, not bad, not bad.
She thinks that this guy is a great guy, and in fact, she told her mother that he's just the nicest guy she's ever met.
Tall, dark, and handsome, LaTanya had long harbored a soft spot in her heart for Jamal. In fact, their connection had never been strictly platonic.
They did pretty much have an on-again, off-again relationship. Both of them described it that way, or more like friends with benefits.
While their physical attraction for one another was undeniable, the two friends felt it best to keep their relationship an open one.
was really a different kind of relationship. LaTanya had seen other people and has had Jamal, and they were both aware of that, but they would still get together and be intimate and enjoy each other's company.
But in the fall of 2011, LaTanya and Jamal's relationship took an unexpected turn.
Got some good news for you.
Oh, yeah? What's up?
I'm pregnant.
LaTanya wanted him to make the decision to be a part of this child's life, and I really think to be in her life as well. He's a good guy. He's a good friend. And I think she perhaps saw a future with him.
While LaTanya embraced the idea of parenthood, to her surprise, Jamal didn't share her enthusiasm.
Initially, Jamal was very reluctant to have the baby and initially wanted LaTanya to have an abortion.
You plan on keeping it?
Yes, Jamal, I plan on keeping it. Where did that come from?
I think when she got pregnant, Jamal kind of broke off contact for a while.
What? Jamal.
But by the time LaTanya reached her third trimester, Jamal had rekindled their relationship and was as excited about the baby as she was.
So, what about Glendon?
Glendon? Gillespie.
No.
Come on, that's original. Come on, nobody's got that name.
They were discussing names for the baby. This was, getting very close, and they started to go out and see more of one another.
With their relationship back on track, the couple made plans for a date at a local drive-in theater.
Why don't we go to the movies or something? Let's go hit the drive-in or something.
The drive-in?
Yeah, we're not gonna have any time once the baby comes, so we might as well go live a little bit.
You got a point.
Exactly, don't I, baby?
In her eyes, she was getting together with the father of her child to talk through some issues that, of course, two expectant parents are going to have to deal with.
On Friday, May 25th, 2012, LaTanya drove her SUV to the home Jamal shared with his mother. After picking him up, the two headed to the nearby city of Dearborn for a midnight showing at the drive-in. As they watched the film, the two reconnected in ways neither expected.
Baby, look. Now, you know I'm always here for you, right?
Prove it. So I don't
Prove
believe
it.
you. I don't believe
What
it
I gotta
right
do
now.
to prove it, huh?
I don't know.
Come,
You tell me.
Come here, girl.
They had sex there in the car at the drive-in.
For LaTanya and Jamal, this passionate encounter seemed to cement the rock-solid nature of their relationship. But little did they know that in a few short hours, their lives would take a horrific turn, leaving a young woman fighting for her life and a community desperate for answers.
All of a sudden, she can smell accelerant. And then she kind of hears a click. And the next thing she knows, she can hear crackling. And it's her hair that's on fire.
Yeah.
LaTanya Bowman and Jamal Rogers had been friends since high school, but it didn't take long for the relationship to become more than mere friendship. In September of 2011, LaTanya became pregnant with Jamal's child. And after shaking off a case of cold feet, Jamal seemed ready to be a loving boyfriend and father.
They sort of rekindled their relationship, I guess, or at least were going to try.
The couple's love for each other seemed so intense that just a few weeks before their child was due, Jamal and LaTanya shared a heated tryst at a local drive-in.
They had sex there in the car, in the SUV at the drive-in that they had went to.
But just when it seemed the couple's relationship couldn't get any more perfect, the unthinkable happened. Early on May 26, 2012, just hours after her and Jamal's romantic evening at the drive-in, LaTanya was abducted from Jamal's garage by an unknown assailant. Bound and gagged, she was lit on fire, shot, and left for dead.
The crime that LaTanya Bowman was a victim of has to rank as one of the most heinous.
I think even for a city like Detroit, the nature of this crime was shocking.
Now, as LaTanya fights for her life and the life of her unborn child in the hospital, police begin to try and piece together what happened. But the key to cracking the case comes down to one important factor.
I needed to talk to the victim. I needed to hear what happened firsthand from her.
Shot in the shoulder and suffering from second and third degree burns, LaTanya has been transferred to the hospital trauma unit. But despite her life-threatening injuries, she's remained conscious throughout her ordeal.
LaTanya, I'm Detective Barnes. Just wanted to ask you a few questions, if I could. Tanya, I know you're hurting, but I'd like to go through the events of last night. Can you just start from the beginning and tell me what happened?
Visibly shaken, LaTanya lays out the frightening details of her abduction.
Jamal and I went to the drive-in, and I drove back home, and he said that he was gonna open the garage door.
Hey, right here. Let me go open up the garage so you can back in.
Okay.
According to LaTanya, Jamal opened the garage. Just as she parked the car, all hell broke loose.
While inside of the garage, an unknown person came up and grabbed her and held a gun to her head.
Get out of the car! Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
LaTanya tells detectives she did her best to comply with her assailant's demands.
She's in no condition to fight, being 9 months pregnant, so she just complies with what the gunman asked her to do.
The tape didn't cover the bottom of her eyeglasses, so she was able to sort of see just glimpses of the skin on his wrist.
She never sees the person behind her, but her hands are tied up, her feet are bound, her mouth is taped, and she's thrown in the backseat of the vehicle.
Get in the car! I said get in there!
With LaTanya bound and blindfolded, her assailant jumped behind the wheel and took off.
Next thing I know, it felt like we were driving.
Everything happened so quickly, LaTanya isn't sure if Jamal is safe and sound inside the house or had also been attacked.
She's thinking to herself, whatever happened to Jamal, but even more importantly, what's happening to me? How do I protect my baby? How do I get out of this?
LaTanya claims her assailant drove for several minutes before stopping in what seemed to be a remote area. LaTanya hoped her nightmare was nearing an end. Unfortunately, things were about to get much worse.
The gunman had opened the door, and then she remembers feeling a liquid being poured on. She could smell a gassy substance. And she said next thing she knew, she was on fire.
As she feels her hair and her body catching fire, she rolls out of the car and begins rolling around frantically trying to put the fire out.
She described the smell of her burning hair, the crackling of her skin burning. It had to be a horrific set of circumstances for her to live through.
But as LaTanya attempted to extinguish the flames, she suddenly heard a loud pop.
She hears 2 gunshots, one of which strikes her. Believing that she'll be dead soon, she instinctively plays dead.
Miss Bowman performed an amazingly heroic act of having the strength while you're still on fire to be able to play dead. It is just an amazing thing given those horrific circumstances. And the assailant then walked away.
LaTanya tells detectives that once she was sure her abductor had fled the scene, she put out the flames and shook herself free from the duct tape binding her hands and feet.
I heard him run off. When I thought that he was gone, I crawled to the car.
She doesn't have her cell phone at the time that was taken by the gunman. She sees a gas station that she's familiar with. She goes and uses the phone there.
LaTanya doesn't call 911. She's less concerned with her own safety than she is her mother's.
Ma, I need for you to leave the house. I'm coming to get you.
She thinks her mother is next, and her mother's in grave danger. And somehow, even without her glasses, even in great pain, she manages to get to her mom's house.
Oh my God, what happened to you? Let's go to the hospital. Move over.
Shocked by the sight of her daughter's condition, her mother jumped in the car and rushed LaTanya to the hospital.
It's incredible that she lived. This young woman was her own hero.
Police are astonished by LaTanya's chilling story. But just what could have prompted the attack? And why was LaTanya so gravely concerned about her mother's safety? Apparently, it wasn't the first time a threat had been made against their family.
She's worried about her mother because 2 weeks earlier, there was an incident where a man came to the door very early in the morning. Mom opens the door. Guy sticks a gun in Mom's face. Pulls the trigger, but nothing happens. And he just kind of runs off.
Miss Bowman thought, oh my God, does this have anything to do with that incident? Does this have anything to do with my mother?
Judging by the timing of the two events, LaTonya can't help but fear the worst.
She believes the incident that happened at her house a few weeks earlier is related to what happened to her this evening.
We'll be in touch. Get some rest.
For detectives, LaTonya's statement provides the first break in the case. But before they can follow up on this new lead, they must answer an even more pressing question. Is the father of LaTonya's unborn child, Jamal Rogers, alive and well? Or has he met a fate even worse than hers?
Where was Jamal? We needed to go find him.
In Detroit, a terrifying crime has taken place involving the unlikeliest of victims. 9 months pregnant, LaTonya Bowman was abducted, set on fire, and shot. Amazingly, LaTonya tricked her assailant into believing she was dead.
The whole time she's thinking about her baby. And that's what gave her the courage to play dead. It saves her life.
And after her attacker fled the scene, LaTonya made her way to the hospital, but not before checking on her mother to make sure she hadn't been targeted as well.
I've been kidnapped.
In speaking with detectives, LaTonya reveals that the assault might be related to a separate incident that occurred only a couple weeks earlier.
2 weeks prior to the attack, an unknown male showed up at LaTonya's mom's house. When she came to the door, he pointed a gun in her face and pulled the trigger. But the gun did not fire. The male then ran off.
Adding to the mystery is the fact that police aren't sure if LaTonya's attacker also went after Jamal, the father of her unborn child. While one team of officers conducts welfare checks at both LaTonya and Jamal's residences, others fan out across the city in an effort to determine the exact location of the vacant lot where the shooter abandoned LaTonya.
Well, the first thing you think of is this guy shoots somebody and then throws the gun in the street someplace and some 3-year-old finds it. It was a top priority to find that gun. The shell casings, anything we could find in relation to the crime.
But given that LaTonya was blindfolded during the attack, locating the crime scene proves easier said than done.
It was difficult for her to describe a lot of the things around her because it was dark.
So we drove around, hoping to find some evidence of the scene. We were unable to do that.
It's not long before detectives hit another roadblock, hoping to establish a possible link between LaTonya's abduction and the earlier threat made on her family. Detectives reach out to her mother, Angela Beatty.
So I understand from LaTonya that you had some sort of confrontation.
Yeah, it was about 2 weeks ago.
But not only is LaTonya's mother unable to ID the man who allegedly threatened her, she's unsure the two events are even related.
I don't really think it has anything to do with LaTonya at all. I just figured somebody might have just been mad.
LaTonya's mom worked for the city, so sometimes you're dealing with irate citizens, etc. And based on that, she felt it had nothing to do with what happened to LaTonya.
Absolutely not.
Just when it seems like the case has hit a dead end,
Barnes,
detectives receive some promising news from their fellow officers.
you have him there.
Jamal Rogers is alive and well.
Thank you for your time. We need to go.
Officers encountered him during the welfare check of his house, the same house where LaTonya was kidnapped. Detectives are eager to hear his version of the attack.
Jamal Rogers?
Yes?
Need to ask you some questions about LaTonya Bowman.
Surprisingly, Jamal's account of what happened couldn't be more different than LaTonya's.
Jamal said that they left the drive-in theater, came back to his house on Sherman, and parked at the curb.
She dropped you off here?
Yeah, she dropped me off. Yeah, we were out there at the curb, talked for about maybe 10 minutes or so. Then I got out and she drove off.
With Jamal's statement at odds with LaTonya's, detectives wonder if Jamal might be withholding information.
You're sure she dropped you at the curb?
Yeah, positive.
That's when Jamal drops a bombshell.
Is there anybody here that can corroborate that?
Yeah, my mom and my girlfriend and my kids.
You have another girlfriend?
Yeah.
And not one, but two children.
This is a guy who's getting a little bit of action because he's got a girlfriend right here and a pregnant pal over here.
Given LaTonya's statement and Jamal's startling revelation, detectives can't help but wonder. Could Jamal's girlfriend have orchestrated LaTonya's abduction out of jealousy? And if so, is Jamal now trying to protect her?
We know that Jamal watched this whole incident happen in his garage. He knew more than he was letting on.
Hoping to get to the bottom of this mystery, detectives reach out to a number of Jamal's neighbors. They're hoping to glean additional information about the attack on LaTonya. They catch a break when someone in Jamal's neighborhood tells them they saw Jamal and LaTonya return home from the drive-in the night of the crime.
Apparently there's this character who lives in the neighborhood, and this guy had his eyes open, and he saw them go into that garage, backing into the garage with LaTonya.
With an eyewitness backing LaTonya's story, police decide to bring Jamal in for further questioning. Detectives press Jamal to explain why his version of events is so different than either LaTonya's or his neighbors.
He instructs LaTonya to pull into this detached garage from his home so they can finish what they supposedly started at the movie theater.
Jamal changes his story and says, yeah, they did pull into the garage.
So you're out of the car? Yes. So you had to close the garage door. She obviously didn't do it, right? Yes.
But before Jamal talks about what happened next, he suddenly has a change of heart.
I think I remember. You want a lawyer? Yeah.
Basically, lawyers up, clams up. That's it. He's done.
Jamal's sudden reluctance to talk raises more than a few red flags with detectives. They decide to hold him in county jail on suspicion of murder. But they're still uncertain whether Jamal's girlfriend could be personally involved. Interviewing her that day, detectives are stunned by what she tells them.
What can you tell me about LaTonya Bowman?
I really don't know that name.
I don't believe that either of the women knew of the other.
Okay, well, were you aware that Jamal was seeing Miss Bowman?
No, I was not.
The fact that Jamal's girlfriend has no idea he's been sleeping with LaTonya seemingly undermines any motive she might have to try and kill her. It also places Jamal alone at the top of the suspect list.
We didn't consider the current girlfriend a suspect, and we believed their relationship at that point didn't come into play.
Desperate for physical evidence, investigators turn their attention to LaTonya's SUV.
Her vehicle was seized, and inside the vehicle, there's some pieces of burned clothing, but there was also a roll of black Gorilla duct tape, which we believe that was the duct tape used by the gunman.
However, DNA tests conducted on both the clothing and duct tape failed to connect Jamal or anyone else to the crime. The case appears to be at a standstill.
The only thing I had going for me at the time was kind of a little bit of hope. I wanted Jamal Rogers to talk to me again.
A few hours later, Detective Barnes' hopes are realized when Jamal Rogers does a surprising about-face.
I almost started to move on to what's the next step going to be. How are we going to identify this other person if Jamal Rogers is not going to give him up? And I walked him all the way back to his cell, and just as I put him in his cell, he said, "Can we talk?"
What does Jamal want to say? He's already lied to investigators once. Would this time be any different? Or is Jamal about to provide detectives with a piece of information that will break the case wide open? On May 26, 2012, expectant mother LaTonya Bowman was kidnapped from inside the garage at the home of her boyfriend, Jamal Rogers. LaTonya was then lit on fire, shot, and left to die in a vacant lot.
So she's been on fire, and then she feels a gunshot. She decides to play dead.
Miraculously, LaTonya survived the terrible ordeal, and the subsequent investigation has led police to the father of her unborn child, Jamal Rogers.
We believe that he was complicit in this abduction and attempt murder.
While initially reluctant to cooperate with police, after being taken into custody, Jamal decides to talk.
He tells cops, "I know who did this."
For detectives, it's a much-needed break in the case.
I just told him that I'm not going to go sit down there and speak to you for 2 hours unless you're going to give me something, so you're going to have to give me a name. And he said, Antonio Valentine Mathis.
Antonio Mathis is no stranger to law enforcement.
He's been in jail, he's done some time, and he's just a really bad guy. And he also happens to be pals with Jamal Rogers. He's his roommate.
Jamal described their relationship, said they were like brothers. He had allowed Antonio to watch his kids. He just trusted him that much.
According to Jamal, he'd recently confided in Antonio about some problems he was having with LaTanya, and his friend offered to lend a hand.
What'd you say to him?
I said I didn't really want to have another baby.
I don't want to have another baby, man. I can't deal with this, that kind of a thing?
Yes.
So he said,
I could take care of it.
Jamal tells detectives he had no idea what Antonio meant when he said he could take care of it, and he was surprised to find Antonio in his garage when he and LaTanya returned home from the drive-in.
I did say something to him when I seen him showing to the car. I was just, what are you doing? What are you doing? What is this about? And he's just like, I got you. Don't worry about it.
Jamal insists Antonio acted on his own.
I didn't ask him to do it. I didn't ask him to do anything.
Jamal's position was that Antonio took this on his own accord and thought to himself, hey, why don't I help Jamal out and somehow help terminate the baby, get her upset or whatever.
Detectives are anxious to speak with Antonio Mathis. They search the neighborhood where he and Jamal live, but can't find him anywhere. At least not until an unexpected tip comes in.
We received a phone call. It was an anonymous phone call. I learned he was going back over the Sherman address. In fact, our officers were sitting on the crime scene. He was arrested.
Even with Antonio in custody, detectives' hopes of getting a confession are soon dashed.
when they got back at 1:30, you're in the garage. I never came back to the house that night. I came back to the house the next morning. He was lying about everything. I mean, I don't know.
Antonio denies any knowledge of this whole event. He says he just got pointed out as a guy that, because he had a record, he would be a good fall guy.
Antonio also claims he has an airtight alibi. He was with his girlfriend the night of the crime.
She's gonna be your alibi for the whole night. I mean, that's all we do. What's her name?
The assailant's alibi was a friend of his, Tanisha McCaddy. She picked him up at midnight and drove him to another girl's house. That girl, Crystal King, was with him at the time of the assault.
Investigators suspect Antonio's alibi is bogus. And after speaking with Crystal King and Tanisha McCaddy, that suspicion is justified.
The timeline that he gave us was totally inconsistent with what had actually happened, according to Tanisha McCaddy and his girlfriend.
Tanisha and Crystal both state that Antonio didn't hook up with them until the morning after the crime, which supports the theory that Antonio was the gunman who attacked LaTanya Bowman. But did Antonio act alone? Or did he and Jamal conspire to murder Jamal's pregnant girlfriend? In order to elicit more information from their two prime suspects, detectives make a bold play.
Cops are pretty clever. You know, they're going to start playing these two guys against each other.
I thought we maybe would talk to Jamal again and see if maybe he'd give us a little bit more.
He claims he's innocent. Wasn't anywhere near you and LaTanya. And he's got an alibi and witnesses. Man, he lying. Jamal, you're gonna have to give me something concrete, or I'm gonna have to let him go, and you're gonna go down for the whole thing.
I was kind of acting a little mad at him. I told him, this is your last chance. You're gonna give me some evidence that I can corroborate, or that's it. We're done talking.
The two words Jamal utters next will lead detectives to the unlikeliest of locations. A location that will bring them one step closer to putting LaTanya's true attacker behind bars. Police now believe Jamal Rogers is responsible for the attempted murder of LaTanya Bowman, the mother of his unborn child. But Jamal insists he's innocent and pins the crime on his best friend and roommate.
Man, he lying.
He's going to roll over on his buddy, this guy named Antonio Mathis.
Jamal claims that shortly before the attack on LaTanya, he made an offhand comment about not wanting another child. Unbeknownst to Jamal, Antonio took his comment seriously and without his knowledge, orchestrated the hit on Jamal's pregnant girlfriend. However, when Antonio was arrested, he claims no knowledge of the attack on LaTanya.
Antonio said he didn't do anything. It's all Jamal.
According to Antonio, he was with his girlfriend Crystal King and pal Tanisha McCaddy the night of the crime. But Crystal and Tanisha tell detectives that's simply not the case.
We knew we had the right guy. The question is, Do we have enough to make it stick?
The other question is whether Antonio acted alone, as Jamal Rogers claims, or whether the two men conspired to attack LaTonya.
He's thrown you under the bus. He's going to do whatever he can to save his own ass right now. He already did. He already did. He told us he told you not to do anything to her. You know what that looks like? You went out and did this on your own.
In an effort to uncover the truth, detectives then decide to play Jamal and Antonio against each other.
Jamal, you're gonna have to give me something concrete, or I'm gonna have to let him go, and you're gonna go down for the whole thing.
Fearful of taking the fall for the crime all by himself, Jamal offers 2 words.
Jamal says,
Home Depot.
I drove him to Home Depot right before I went to go to the movies with LaTonya.
Operating off this information, detectives reach out to a nearby Home Depot. They are able to confirm that the gloves and duct tape found in LaTonya's car were indeed purchased there.
Home Depot was nice enough to provide us with the exact items that he purchased from their shelves. So we had SKU number for the duct tape. We had the exact type of Gorilla duct tape, the exact gloves he bought.
Detectives confront Antonio Mathis with this evidence, but Antonio remains adamant he had nothing to do with the crime.
But I guess he forgot. Home Depot has security cameras.
Police are confident that if the surveillance footage places Antonio at the store, they'll have enough probable cause to charge him with attempted murder. Detective John Barnes screens the security footage, but after 90 minutes, there's still no sign of their prime suspect.
You know, and Antonio hasn't come into the store, and I almost started thinking, what do we do now that we don't have this piece of evidence?
But just as he's about to give up, Detective Barnes finally hits pay dirt.
Right there, look.
I think it was around 9:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the store closed. In walks Antonio Mathis. I knew right then that we'd locked Antonio Mathis into this.
There he goes. He's got the gloves and he's got the duct tape. That's what we've been looking for.
Even with this video evidence, detectives are still fairly confident that Antonio didn't act alone. They believe Jamal Rogers, already saddled with 2 young children, couldn't bear the thought of having to support another child with LaTonya. And when Antonio told Jamal he could make his problem go away, Jamal jumped at the offer.
I think that Antonio told Jamal, I can take care of this for you. And by take care, we know that means kill her and the baby, and the problem goes away.
On May 29, 2012, police officially charged Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis with unlawful imprisonment, assault with intent to commit murder, and conspiracy. News of Jamal's arrest adds insult to LaTonya's already devastating injuries.
I think she loved him, and she didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to believe that he was capable of something like this. And I could understand.
Ironically, the same day charges are filed against the 2 men, LaTonya gives birth to a healthy baby boy.
The baby is fine. Mom, LaTonya, is apparently recovering physically. This is an incredible story of courage and survival.
Over the next year, LaTonya also begins to heal emotionally as she waits for justice to be served.
She went through some tough times, and we weren't going to rest. Not from day one, not until this is over with, and we get the results that she deserves.
On May 22, 2013, the trial of Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis begins in a Macomb County courtroom. In their opening statement, prosecutors assert Jamal Rogers, not wanting to be a father again, asked his friend Antonio Mathis to kill his pregnant girlfriend, LaTonya Bowman.
Obviously, Mr. Mathis was supposed to kill Miss Bowman. She was totally blindsided by the violence that she was subjected to at both of their hands.
Prosecutors then lay out the evidence tying Antonio to the crime. The duct tape and the gloves found in LaTonya's SUV, as well as the security footage that shows Antonio Mathis purchasing them the night of the attack.
Having the Gorilla duct tape in that courtroom and being able to show them, this is what was bought and this is what we found in the car. And them actually seeing that purchase made, that was huge.
After presenting the physical evidence, prosecutors turned to their star witness, LaTonya Bowman. Everyone in the courtroom is mesmerized as she gives a blow-by-blow account of her nightmarish abduction.
She was very calm in her testimony, which is kind of typical of her actions throughout this ordeal. I think the jury was absolutely listening to every word that she said and were undoubtedly impacted.
On the stand, LaTonya admits she had a hard time believing that Jamal was involved in the crime. But she also refutes Jamal's claim that they had sex the night of the abduction.
She denied the sex at the drive-in theater. Jamal seemed to be totally baffled by that why she's saying that. You know, that was a big part of his case.
But not everything LaTonya testifies to bolsters the prosecution's case. Her inability to concretely identify her assailant is a boon for the defense.
She readily admitted that the defendant was shorter than the man that she felt had abducted her. She really didn't pinpoint my client as being the person that abducted her.
Beyond LaTonya's testimony, the defense also argues that Jamal and Antonio's DNA was never found on the gloves and duct tape, nor was there the usual paper trail left behind when one person solicits another to commit murder on their behalf.
We had shown that there was absolutely no financial things happening between Mr. Rogers and Mr. Mathis. There was no withdrawals or anything like that on Mr. Rogers' part. There was no deposits on top of Mr. Mathis like there normally might be if somebody's asking somebody to commit a crime.
Despite LaTonya's heroic turn on the stand, there seems to be nothing but some security footage linking Antonio to the crime and zero physical evidence implicating Jamal. A guilty verdict seems unlikely. But before the jury weighs in, the prosecution will unveil a surprise witness, one whose shocking testimony will be the deciding factor between two men walking free or being locked up for life. The trial of Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis for the attempted murder of LaTonya Bowman is wrapping up. Armed with a security tape of Antonio purchasing items that were used in the crime, along with LaTonya's gripping testimony, the prosecution is feeling confident.
We were all of the mind that we presented the best case we could possibly present.
But defense attorneys argue there's simply no proof that their clients plotted any murder.
There's no actual concrete evidence of any sort that there was any kind of conspiracy between the people.
However, prosecutors still have one last witness on the docket, Antonio's friend, Tanisa McCaddy. On the stand, Tanisa reveals a detailed conversation she had with Antonio shortly after the attack on LaTonya.
McCaddy, she said he was unusually quiet, and she asked him what was wrong, and he didn't want to tell her, and he just said nothing, but I need you to stay away from me for a while.
If I remember, the exact words may have been, we did some awful to a pregnant woman. So she did testify to that in court, and that certainly didn't sound good at all.
Well, this guy, Antonio Mathis, is a real brain surgeon. I mean, who actually does something like this? And then they talk about it and even brag about it. But that's what Antonio did, and that's what also helped police nail him to the wall.
But is it enough to convince the jury that both Antonio and Jamal were involved in the crime? After 3 hours of deliberations, the jury returns with their verdict. They find Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis guilty on all charges.
The first thing we all did is, after hearing guilty of all charges, is we all looked at Miss Bowman, and we all went and hugged her.
2 months later, the two defendants are sentenced to life in prison. The judge has some particularly harsh words for Jamal.
Even though you did not light the match or pull the trigger, you orchestrated perhaps one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. You diabolically and in cold blood plotted, schemed, and arranged the murder of your unborn child.
Jamal, once he's sentenced, basically blows a kiss to the audience. It's incredible arrogance.
For LaTonya Bowman, the sentencing serves as a bittersweet end to her tragic relationship with Jamal. And while the physical and emotional scars wrought by his betrayal still linger, LaTonya refuses to be defined by what happened that fateful night in 2012.
You'd think it just...
The winter of 2002 in Detroit was not just a season of record-breaking snowfall. It was a period of suffocating silence that settled over the city, a silence born of a disappearance that defied every logic of investigation and left the community in a state of perpetual, shivering unease. When 18-year-old Chloe Sterling stepped out of her family's home in the quiet suburbs on a Tuesday evening, The sky was a bruised shade of purple, the air thick with the promise of a blizzard that would eventually swallow the city in a blanket of white. She was heading to a neighborhood library, a 5-minute walk that had become a routine of safety and comfort, yet she never arrived. By midnight, the city was buried under 6 inches of fresh powder, a blank canvas that wiped away tire tracks, footprints, and every whisper of evidence that might have pointed toward her fate. It was a cold case from the moment the first searchlight cut through the dark, an investigation launched into the void, where the only thing louder than the wind whipping against the empty streets was the deafening absence of the young girl who had vanished into the thin, frozen air. Neighbors stood on their porches, their breath misting in the freezing air, watching as police cruisers rolled slowly down the street, their sirens silenced by the snow, creating an atmosphere of mourning before anyone even knew for sure that the worst had come to pass. The weeks that followed turned into a grueling, demoralizing crawl, as the Detroit Police Department threw everything they had at a puzzle that possessed no edges and no middle, only a gaping, dark center. Chloe was a scholarship student, a girl whose life was documented in straight A's and aspirations, a girl with no enemies, no dark secrets, and no reason to simply walk away from a future that she had worked so hard to build. And yet, the void remained. Search teams waded through the icy sludge of the Detroit River. Divers plunged into the murky, freezing depths, and K-9 units tore through the skeletal remains of abandoned factories, their handlers hoping for a scent that the wind hadn't already claimed. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every person of interest had an ironclad alibi, verified by receipts, surveillance, or witnesses who could not be shaken. The frustration within the precinct was palpable, a growing, bitter resentment among detectives who knew that a predator was moving through the city, invisible and untouchable, and that the snow was the greatest accomplice a killer had ever known. It wasn't just the investigation that stalled. It was the soul of the community that began to fray. The Sterling family home became a shrine to a ghost, a place where time had effectively stopped in November 2002, with half-read books still on the table and a winter coat still hanging by the front door. The mystery of Chloe Sterling became a staple of Detroit lore, a haunting story told to keep doors locked and children close. A reminder that in a city built on the mechanics of industry and progress, there were still spaces where individuals could be erased without a single soul hearing a cry. The lead detective, a man whose hair turned white in the shadow of the case, spent years walking the same route Chloe had taken, looking for a detail, a forgotten scrap of paper, a loose floorboard in a shed, a misplaced memory that might finally peel back the veil of the mystery. But years turned into decades, and the file moved from the active desk to the cold storage, an archived tragedy buried under the weight of newer, fresher nightmares, until the name Chloe Sterling became a whisper, a footnote, a cold case that the city had tried, and failed, to put to rest. Then, the static of the past was finally shattered by a sound that no one was expecting, the quiet thud of a delivery into the precinct's Dropbox on a rainy Wednesday in 2026. Inside was an old, leather-bound diary, its pages brittle, its ink faded to a sepia tone, belonging to a woman who had passed away in a nursing home just 2 weeks prior. The diary was not a confession in the traditional sense, but a series of observations, a meticulous, terrifying record of a life lived in the shadow of guilt. The anonymous tip, scrawled on a single piece of lined paper tucked into the back cover, provided the coordinates of a basement, a set of dates that aligned with the 2002 disappearance, and a name that had been buried in the background of the original investigation for 24 years. The shock that hit the department was absolute, a sudden, blinding realization that the key to the most infamous cold case in Detroit history had been sitting in plain sight, protected by a wall of secrets that was only now, finally, crumbling. Detectives descended upon the address, a nondescript, brick facade residence on the outskirts of the city, with a speed and intensity that hadn't been seen in years. The house was exactly as it had been described in the diary, a place that felt like a time capsule where the dust of 2 decades hung in the air like a ghost. They worked with the precision of surgeons, moving through the structure, looking for the physical manifestation of the diary's words. When they reached the basement, a space that smelled of wet earth and ancient decay, they found it, the loose segment of the concrete floor that had been poured over with a slightly different color of aggregate, a patch job that had held the secret of Chloe Sterling for 24 years. The air in the room was heavy, stagnant, as forensic teams set up their equipment, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They knew they were on the threshold of not just solving a case, but of finally allowing a grieving family to stop waiting for a daughter who was never coming home. The excavation was a slow, agonizing process, a task that demanded total silence and total focus. Every tap of the jackhammer was like a heartbeat. Every piece of debris removed was a step toward the truth. As they reached the depth that the diary had indicated, the tension became almost physical, a weight that pressed down on every officer present. And then, the discovery. Personal items, preserved in the earth, and the skeletal remains that told the final, tragic story of the night the snow fell over Detroit. The identification of the remains as Chloe Sterling was almost a formality. The evidence found alongside her, the locket she had been wearing the night she disappeared, confirmed it beyond any doubt. The case that had been a festering wound in the heart of the city was finally closing, but the revelation of who had kept the secret and why was only just beginning to unfurl, a revelation that would implicate people of influence, people who had spent 24 years building lives on the foundation of a lie. As the news broke, the city reacted with a mixture of raw agony and cold, calculated fury. The identity of the owner of the diary was confirmed, a woman who had been the wife of a local high-ranking official at the time of the disappearance, a woman who had lived with the weight of the murder in her home, in her bed, for 2 decades. The diary was a narrative of complicity, a terrifying, itemized account of the violence her husband had committed and the ways she had helped him cover his tracks, scrubbing floors, burning clothes, and creating the alibis that had led the police astray in 2002. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a collision of domestic horror and public corruption that turned the story from a simple abduction into a sprawling, multi-layered scandal that reached into the highest offices of the city. The husband, now an old man, was taken into custody not with a fight, but with a look of resignation, a man who had finally realized that his 40-year-long game of hide-and-seek with the truth had come to an end. The trial that followed was a theater of the grotesque, a place where the diary was read out, page by agonizing page, to a packed courtroom. Every detail of Chloe's final hours was laid bare, the cruelty of the killer contrasted with the cold, calculating indifference of the woman who had watched it happen and stayed silent. The community watched, their collective trauma finally finding a voice, a witness, and an outlet. They saw the faces of a Sterling family, their grief now refined into a hard, diamond-like resolve, as they finally got the answers they had been denied for half their lives. The case, once a mystery that had seemed to have no ending, had become a testament to the fact that no secret is truly buried, no matter how deep the concrete or how heavy the snow. The killer was sentenced to life, a small, final measure of justice for a life that had been so viciously and completely stolen. The resolution left a hollow in the city that no amount of legal finality could truly fill. The house was torn down, the lot cleared, and a small park dedicated to Chloe Sterling was built in its place, but the memory of the winter of 2002 lingered, a persistent, chilling reminder of the fragility of safety. People still walked the same streets, but they walked them with a different kind of awareness, a recognition that the monsters of the world are not always lurking in the shadows. They are sometimes sitting at the dinner table, living the same lives, breathing the same air. The mystery was gone, but the lesson remained. The darkness is always there, and it is only the relentless pursuit of the truth, the quiet, persistent voice of history, that ever keeps it at bay. The diary, now an item of evidence in a closed file, sat in the archives, a silent witness to a tragedy that had finally, through a final act of deathbed courage, been brought into the light. As the years continue to turn, the name Chloe Sterling lives on, not as a victim of a mystery, but as the catalyst for a fundamental change in how the city views its own history. The cold case is solved, the files are locked, and the city of Detroit has moved forward, Yet every November, when the first heavy snowfall blankets the streets and the city goes quiet, a collective breath is held. It is a moment of remembrance, a moment of silence for a girl who never made it to the library, and a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest winter, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, breaking through the ice, and demanding to be seen. The shadows that once defined the city have been pushed back, but they have not disappeared entirely. They wait, just out of sight, a constant, quiet reminder that vigilance is the price we pay for the lives we lead, and that justice, however long it takes, is the only way to finally lay the ghosts to rest. The case of Chloe Sterling is now part of the curriculum, a study in the persistence of investigators and the fragility of secrets. Students of criminal justice look at the diary, at the photographs of the evidence, and they are struck by the sheer, terrifying reality of the passage of time. They see that the killer was not a mastermind, but a man who had made a series of choices, a man who thought he had outsmarted the world by burying the truth beneath the floor. They learn that the greatest tool of the investigator is not just the computer or the DNA sequencer, but the willingness to look back, to open the boxes that everyone else has walked past, and to listen to the whispers of the past. The legacy of the case is a testament to the idea that no one is truly forgotten, that the weight of a secret is a burden that eventually breaks even the strongest resolve, and that the light, while slow, will always, inevitably, find its way into the basement of the past. As the forensic anthropologists continued their work in the basement, the site evolved into a grim archaeological dig that revealed more than just the remains of a young girl. It revealed the pathology of a life spent in deep, active denial. The killer, Arthur Vance, a man who had held a mid-level position in the city's urban development office, had been the embodiment of suburban stability. He was the man who organized the neighborhood block parties, the man who volunteered for the local school board, and the man who, in the eyes of his peers, had been an exemplary husband and father. The revelation that he had been living a dual existence, that he had spent his nights analyzing the city's maps not to improve its infrastructure, but to identify the most vulnerable routes for his predatory excursions, left the community in a state of absolute, existential vertigo. The diary detailed how he viewed the entire city as a chessboard, how he studied the patterns of student life, the shift changes at local libraries, and the quietest, darkest corners of the suburbs, waiting for the perfect intersection of opportunity and isolation. The investigators discovered that Arthur Vance's methods were disturbingly surgical. The diary, which was clearly written by his wife, Martha, documented his obsession with control and his deep-seated need to exert power over those he considered beneath him. She wrote of the nights he would return home with blood-stained hands, his demeanor strangely calm, even jovial, as he went about his evening routines as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The horror for the detectives was the realization that Arthur had not been acting out of some sudden, uncontrollable urge. He was a predator who had spent years refining his approach, learning how to vanish in the cold, how to manipulate the environment to his advantage, and how to use his status within the community to deflect any potential suspicion. Every detail of his life, his choice of vehicle, the way he dressed, the language he used with his colleagues, was a carefully calibrated performance designed to keep the mask of the respectable citizen firmly in place. The legal team assigned to the case faced the monumental task of building a prosecution against a man whose defense would rely heavily on the fact that no direct witness had ever seen him commit the crime, and that the physical evidence was decades old. However, the diary changed everything. Because Martha Vance had written in such excruciating detail about her husband's actions, the specific dates, the tools he used, the methods he employed to silence his victims, the document became the smoking gun that transformed a cold case into an open and shut prosecution. The challenge, however, was the complexity of proving the veracity of the diary in a court of law. Prosecutors had to spend months working with handwriting experts, ink analysis specialists, and behavioral analysts to confirm that the entries were not a fabrication, but a genuine, chronologically accurate account of a life lived in terror and compliance. The process was exhausting, a legal marathon that kept the community on edge as they waited for the announcement of formal charges against a man who had seemingly been untouchable for over 20 years. As the indictment was finalized, the city of Detroit underwent a period of collective introspection that was both painful and necessary. Questions arose about the culture of silence that had allowed Arthur Vance to operate. How many times had his wife considered going to the police? How many times had she witnessed the early warning signs, the obsession with control, the unexplained absences, the erratic changes in his mood, and kept her silence, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps out of a misguided desire to protect the image of their successful, suburban life? The diary became a mirror for the community, forcing them to confront the reality that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who blend in the most seamlessly. The case became a catalyst for local activism, with groups forming to advocate for better domestic safety resources and to encourage the reporting of suspicious behaviors, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant they might appear. The tragedy of Chloe Sterling, which had once been a mystery to be solved, was now a public, urgent call to action. The physical investigation of the basement continued, leading to the discovery of other items that had been stashed away as trophies, small, innocuous objects that, in the context of the diary, took on a chilling, sinister meaning. A hair ribbon, a library card, a small silver charm. Each object was a fragment of a life interrupted, a token of Arthur's perverse need to collect the memories of those he had destroyed. The forensic team spent weeks cataloging every item, their faces grim, their voices hushed, as they realized the full scale of Arthur's predatory career. The diary had hinted at other names, other dates, and other disappearances that had never been reported or had been dismissed as runaways. This meant that the Chloe Sterling case was not an isolated incident. It was the tip of an iceberg that stretched back even further than the 2002 disappearance. The investigators began to reach out to other cold case squads across the state, their work evolving into a regional project that threatened to expose a decades-long pattern of violence that had been hidden by the cold Detroit winters. Inside the interrogation room, the dynamic between Arthur Vance and the lead detective was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Arthur, now a man in his late 60s, sat with an expression of stoic, almost arrogant indifference. He refused to admit to any wrongdoing, his voice steady, his eyes clear and unblinking. He spoke of his career, his community service, and his love for his family, painting a picture of an innocent man being framed by a document that he claimed was a malicious, posthumous fabrication by a wife who had been suffering from mental illness. The detective, knowing that Arthur's calm was a carefully constructed facade, allowed him to talk, to build his own trap, and to slowly reveal the inconsistencies in his own narrative. It was a test of patience, a high-stakes game of nerves where every word mattered, and where the goal was not just to break the suspect, but to force him into a position where he would inadvertently confirm the truth documented in Martha's diary. The strain on the Sterling family was immense, as they were forced to endure the constant presence of the media and the renewed, public scrutiny of their daughter's life and death. They were the center of a national narrative, their grief commercialized, their daughter's memory debated on talk shows, and their private pain used as a headline-grabbing, clickbait hook. Yet they remained resilient, their commitment to seeing justice done for Chloe serving as a focal point for the entire city. They held press conferences where they spoke not of their anger, but of their desire for a final, definitive account of what had happened that winter night. Their presence in the public eye became a source of inspiration for other families still waiting for answers, a symbol of the persistence and strength required to face the truth, however painful it might be. They became the moral center of the investigation, their steady, quiet demand for accountability forcing the legal system to prioritize the case above all others. The deeper the detectives dove into the diary, the more they understood the psychological dynamic between Arthur and Martha. It was not just a case of a wife living in fear, it was a partnership of silence. Martha's entries reflected a woman who had, in the beginning, been drawn to Arthur's confidence and his status, only to discover, bit by bit, the darkness that lay at his core. She wrote of the moments of realization, the terror of discovering his true nature, and the subsequent, grinding erosion of her own identity as she became an accomplice, both through her actions and her continued silence. Her diary was not just a record of crimes. It was an autopsy of her own soul, a brutal, honest assessment of how she had been consumed by the monster she had married. The detectives felt a strange, chilling empathy for her, recognizing that she was the ultimate victim of Arthur's manipulative, predatory nature, trapped in a life she could not escape and forced to be the silent, horrified witness to his monstrous acts. As the weeks of the investigation passed, the scope of the case continued to expand, reaching into aspects of the city's urban development and real estate sectors. Arthur Vance's career had given him access to information, to properties, and to the very maps he had used to hide his tracks. He had been able to influence the planning of infrastructure to ensure that certain areas of the city remained underdeveloped, dark, and isolated, ideal hunting grounds for a man of his nature. The investigation started to uncover potential links between his work in the city office and his ability to move through the environment without detection. The detectives began to map out his professional career alongside his criminal timeline, finding that every time he was promoted, every time he was given oversight over new city projects, the occurrences of disappearances in those areas seemed to correlate. It was a terrifying realization. Arthur had been building his own personal landscape of death, using the very tools he was paid to use for the betterment of the city to secure his own hidden, predatory freedom. The investigation was now moving into a phase where it felt less like a police procedural and more like a high-stakes, political thriller. The connections between Arthur and the city's power structure were beginning to surface, leading to whispers about potential corruption and the intentional neglect of specific urban areas. The Sterling family, now deeply involved with a team of lawyers and investigative journalists, began to press for a more thorough, systemic look at the city's past management, demanding that the authorities account for how a man like Arthur Vance could have remained in such a position of influence for so long. The case was no longer just about Chloe. It was about the integrity of the entire municipal system and the ways in which it had been co-opted, either by active participation or by institutional blindness, to serve the interests of a man who was, in reality, a serial predator of the most sophisticated kind. As the snows of 2026 began to fall, the city of Detroit found itself looking back at the winter of 2002 with a renewed sense of clarity and a burning need for reckoning. The basement, once a place of secret horror, had become a site of national interest, its walls echoing with the final, tragic whispers of the women who had been taken. The investigation into the basement was complete, but the investigation into the system that had allowed Arthur Vance to operate was only just beginning. The diary, a simple, fragile object, had become the catalyst for an awakening, a document that had dismantled a life, a reputation, and the carefully constructed illusion of an entire city's stability. The truth, buried for so long under the weight of concrete and silence, was now rising, piece by piece, and it was demanding to be heard, to be seen, and, most importantly, to be addressed. The cold case was solved, but the final, complete account of the damage done, the people implicated, and the changes required to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again was a task that would occupy the city for years to come. The institutional tremor caused by the unfolding revelations regarding Arthur Vance did not stop at the precinct doors. It tore through the municipal administration of Detroit like a wildfire. As detectives corroborated the entries in Martha's diary with internal city planning documents, they unearthed a labyrinth of corruption that had provided Vance with his ultimate cloaking device. For decades, he had utilized his position in the Urban Development Office to ensure that specific, desolate industrial sectors, the very places where his victims were eventually discovered, remained neglected, poorly lit, and essentially off the grid. He hadn't just hunted in these areas. He had engineered them to be hunting grounds, manipulating zoning laws, stalling maintenance projects, and ensuring that security cameras were never installed in the sectors he favored for his nocturnal activities. The city, which had long prided itself on its industrial resilience, was forced to confront the nauseating realization that a high-ranking official had been actively sabotaging public safety to facilitate his own predatory needs, all while claiming to work for the city's betterment. The legal strategy for the upcoming trial shifted from a singular murder case to a monumental prosecution of systemic exploitation. The district attorney, sensing that the diary provided enough leverage to dismantle Vance's entire professional facade, began subpoenaing 30 years of project logs, budget allocations, and interoffice emails. What they found was a trail of calculated incompetence and deliberate redirection of resources that pointed toward a man who viewed the city's bureaucratic structure not as a set of rules to be followed, but as a series of levers to be pulled. Every time a proposal for street lighting or emergency call boxes surfaced for the neighborhoods adjacent to the industrial parks, Vance had been the one to draft the budgetary feasibility reports that consistently killed these projects. He had quite literally built a shadow city within the official one, a landscape defined by darkness and isolation, specifically tailored to his requirements. The diary, filled with Martha's mundane observations about his dinner table complaints regarding inefficient city spending, became the primary roadmap for the prosecution's case. As the case expanded, the pressure on the Sterling family grew, yet their resolve only deepened. They were no longer just seeking justice for Chloe. They were seeking a complete historical accounting for every woman whose life had been truncated by Vance's engineered isolation. Their legal team organized a town hall meeting that was broadcast nationwide, where they presented the findings of the investigation to the public, detailing how Vance's office had prioritized the developmental potential of certain zones over the safety of the citizens living within them. The narrative transformed. Chloe Sterling was no longer a lone victim of a random abduction, but a casualty of a calculated systemic failure. The city's residents, previously divided by the mundanity of local politics, united in a singular, furious demand for total transparency. The mayor, faced with plummeting approval ratings and a city on the verge of civil unrest, was forced to appoint an independent commission to oversee the investigation, a move that only added to the mounting pressure on Vance's crumbling world. Inside the detention center, Vance's psychological fortification began to show visible cracks. The isolation, while intended to be a safeguard, had become his primary antagonist. Without the ability to manipulate the environment or exert control over the people around him, he was forced to inhabit his own mind, a space that the diary had stripped bare. Behavioral specialists observed that his once arrogant posture had dissolved into a restless, kinetic state. He would spend hours at a time pacing the narrow confines of his cell, whispering to himself, perhaps reliving the moments of his crimes or rehearsing the arguments he would never be allowed to make. His legal team, struggling to find a pathway for a defense, found themselves increasingly sidelined by his refusal to cooperate. He was a man who had built his life on the illusion of absolute agency, and now that agency had been entirely retracted. The diary had not only provided the evidence for his conviction, it had effectively served as his psychological autopsy, leaving him with no narrative left to defend. The emotional toll of the investigation began to permeate every aspect of Detroit's cultural life. Local musicians, artists, and writers began to produce works inspired by the diary, turning Martha's tragic, obsessive documentation into a cultural touchstone. A massive mural was commissioned in the center of the city, depicting the faces of the missing, with Chloe Sterling at the forefront, looking out over a city that had finally woken up to the darkness hidden in its own heart. It was a somber, beautiful reminder of the loss, but it also served as a symbol of the city's ongoing process of healing. The murals and the public displays of grief became a mechanism for the city to externalize the trauma, allowing citizens to collectively process the reality of a monster who had walked among them while he sat in a sterile, white room awaiting a sentence that would effectively bury him for the remainder of his life. Throughout this period, the whereabouts of Martha Vance became the subject of intense, often invasive, public speculation. Having passed away shortly before the diary was turned in, she left behind a legacy that was as complicated as the history she had meticulously recorded. Some viewed her as a co-conspirator, a woman who had traded her conscience for the comfort of a high-status life. Others saw her as the final, trapped victim of the man who had destroyed the city's safety. Her diary was a document of profound moral failure, yet it was also a document of liberation, the final confession of a soul that had been crushed by the weight of a secret it could no longer hold. The diary was eventually donated to the city's historical archives, where it was kept under lock and key, a permanent, chilling reminder of the complexity of complicity and the way in which evil can flourish when the people closest to it choose silence over truth. The forensic teams, having completed their work in the basement, turned their attention to the other sites mentioned in the diary. They began a massive, systematic search across the neglected industrial sectors of Detroit, using ground-penetrating radar to scan for any anomalies in the concrete or the earth. The process was grueling and intensely emotional, with cadaver dogs marking sites that had been forgotten for nearly 20 years. Each time a recovery team entered one of these sites, the city stopped. The media coverage would shift, the air would become heavy, and the entire metropolitan area would focus on the hope and the fear of what the radar might reveal. The diary was proving to be a map of a nightmare, a comprehensive guide to the devastation Arthur Vance had left in his wake. The realization that there might be more victims added a new, urgent layer to the investigation, shifting the goalpost of justice from the singular tragedy of Chloe Sterling to the comprehensive, total accounting of Arthur Vance's serial predation. As the radar results came back, they began to confirm the terrifying scope of his activities. There were indeed more sites, more anomalies, more buried secrets within the neglected corridors of the city. The recovery teams found artifacts that spanned decades: watches, keys, pieces of jewelry, each a small, cold monument to a life that had been systematically erased. The detectives, who had initially thought they were solving a single, notorious cold case, now found themselves at the center of an unprecedented criminal inquiry. The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming, a burden that tested the limits of their professional and psychological endurance. They were essentially digging up the history of a city's ignored violence, one site at a time, guided by the handwritten pages of a woman who had lived in the center of the maelstrom but had remained, for so long, terrifyingly still. The legal strategy now required a shift toward the serial predator classification. Prosecutors began to prepare for a trial that would encompass multiple murder counts, relying on the combined force of the forensic evidence, the city planning records, and the detailed entries in Martha's diary. They sought to establish not just the act of killing, but the pattern of predatory behavior that Vance had nurtured for decades. This shift required a complete overhaul of the evidence presentation. They had to synthesize the disparate elements of his life, his professional decisions, his personal life, and his criminal activities, into a singular, coherent, and undeniable case of systemic violence. It was a legal challenge that required the expertise of teams from all over the country, bringing together experts in crime analysis, city governance, and behavioral psychology to present a portrait of a man who was, in his own way, a master of societal manipulation. During this time, the city of Detroit underwent a quiet, but profound, physical transformation. Neighborhood groups began to organize their own safety patrols, taking a proactive approach to the issues of neglect that had been exposed during the investigation. Abandoned lots were cleaned, lights were installed, and communities that had once been divided by apathy started to rebuild their ties. The tragedy of Chloe Sterling had served as a wake-up call, a realization that safety was not something that could be left to the city's administrative apparatus alone, but something that had to be actively maintained by the people who lived there. The case of Arthur Vance had shattered the community's trust in its own structures, but it had also, in a strange, difficult way, brought the community together in a shared commitment to ensure that such a man could never again take advantage of the shadows. The case had effectively become a national phenomenon, with true crime analysts, legal experts, and investigative journalists from across the globe converging on Detroit to witness the proceedings. The diary had become the focal point of all this attention, a document that had fundamentally altered the way that history and crime intersected. It was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a cultural artifact, a testament to the way that memory, guilt, and the passage of time could converge to destroy even the most meticulously guarded secrets. The investigative team, now bolstered by state and federal resources, spent their days navigating the dense, complex realities of a case that was growing in size and intensity with every passing week. They were working in the shadow of the victims, their efforts guided by the desire to bring peace not only to the Sterlings, but to all the families who were finally beginning to receive the confirmation they had sought for decades. As the trial preparation continued, the the city began to feel the weight of its own past. The investigations were bringing to the surface things that had long been buried, not just beneath concrete, but beneath the layers of denial and institutional complacency that had defined the city's management for years. It was a painful, necessary process of reckoning, a way for the city to acknowledge the extent of its own failings and to begin the work of building a foundation that was based on truth rather than convenience. The diary, in all its devastating detail, remained the center of this process, a simple, small book that had managed, through the sheer weight of its own terrible honesty, to bring a city to its knees and demand that it finally look at the truth of what had happened in its dark and neglected corners. The investigation was continuing, the recoveries were proceeding, and the process of justice, though agonizingly slow, was moving forward, leaving in its wake a city that was forever changed, forever marked, and forever watchful. The fourth phase of the investigation began not with the clatter of machinery, but with the haunting, synchronized silence of an entire city bracing itself. As the forensic recovery teams moved from the initial basement site to the wider, sprawling industrial sector that Arthur Vance had strategically left in decay, the narrative of the case underwent a profound metamorphosis. It was no longer the story of a single, localized atrocity. It was the unfolding of a calculated, multi-decade campaign of erasure. The maps, meticulously reconstructed from Vance's work logs and Martha's diary entries, depicted a landscape that had been treated as a personal hunting ground. Every abandoned warehouse, every desolate stretch of railway siding, and every forgotten manufacturing facility became a focal point for the federal task force. The Dondap, rhythmic progression of the excavation teams, moving with forensic delicacy through the rubble of long-dead factories, was broadcast live, turning the industrial heart of Detroit into a stage for a grim, historic reckoning. The discovery of the second burial site, located beneath the crumbling floorboards of a textile mill in the city's east side, sent a shockwave through the investigative team. When the ground-penetrating radar identified the signature of an industrial barrel, the atmosphere in the sector shifted from professional detachment to an intense, shared trauma. The barrel was encased in high-density foam, a protective measure that spoke to the killer's cold, industrial logic, a way to ensure the evidence would remain preserved, waiting for whatever dark utility he might have for it in the future. As the team unearthed the barrel, the entire city seemed to stop. The recovery was conducted under the glare of high-powered stadium lights, turning the abandoned mill into a cathedral of investigation. The forensic anthropologists, working in near-frozen conditions, carefully dismantled the contents, uncovering items that matched the descriptions of missing women from as far back as 1994. The diary had not been exaggerating. Vance had been operating with a frightening, disciplined rhythm long before the disappearance of Chloe Sterling. The implications for the prosecution were staggering. They were no longer building a case around one life. They were constructing a history of a serial predator whose activities had intersected with the administrative life of the city itself. The legal team had to shift gears, filing a superseding indictment that accounted for these newly discovered victims, linking the timelines of the disappearances to Vance's professional milestones, his promotions, his oversight of specific land development initiatives, and his periods of extended leave that were now clearly identifiable as hunting trips. The diary entries from Martha, which had been the catalyst, now served as the connective tissue for this sprawling history. She had meticulously documented the dates, the stress levels, and the subtle shifts in Arthur's behavior during these periods, creating an undeniable forensic map of his predatory cycles. The prosecution now held a document that was not just a record of crimes, but a behavioral profile written by the one person who had been forced to watch the monster grow. As the scope of the recovery widened, the public's relationship with the industrial landscape of Detroit began to shift. Citizens who had once walked past these derelict, silent spaces without a second thought now viewed them with a mixture of fear and reverence. The Vance sites became temporary zones of national mourning, with local community leaders installing makeshift shrines, candles, flowers, and handwritten notes at the perimeters of the cordoned-off sectors. This outpouring of grief was not directed at the monster, but at the systemic neglect that had allowed him to thrive. The city, Finally coming to terms with the reality of its own administrative failings, began a series of town hall sessions where the primary focus was the reconciliation of public infrastructure with public safety. The diary, read in excerpts during these sessions, became a tool for change, with citizens using Martha's words to demand that no part of their city should ever again be allowed to exist in the shadows. Within the walls of the detention center, Arthur Vance remained a man trapped in his own internal vacuum. The psychological specialists who had been brought in to analyze his response to the expanding investigation noted a strange, detached curiosity in his demeanor. He wasn't resisting the evidence. He seemed to be watching its publication with the clinical interest of an architect reviewing a project he had long since finished. He refused to speak about the new sites, but he would occasionally comment on the precision of the recovery, critiquing the methodology of the forensic teams as if he were an instructor reviewing a student's work. This terrifying display of dissociation was a final, chilling insight into his psyche. He truly viewed the lives he had extinguished as data points, as objects that existed only to satisfy the requirements of his own perverse engineering. The diary had correctly identified this trait, documenting the nights he would return from his work and, instead of seeking solace, would spend hours updating the ledgers he kept of his accomplishments. The recovery process also began to reveal the harrowing lengths to which Arthur had gone to maintain his professional facade. Among the recovered items, investigators found high-level city development blueprints that had been annotated with handwritten notes, marked with symbols that corresponded to the burial locations. These were not random acts of violence. They were components of a master plan, a blueprint of a career that had been meticulously designed to maximize his predatory freedom. He had used the city's resources, its mapping software, its land use data, and its maintenance schedules, as a protective layer for his criminal life. The investigators found that he had systematically steered city resources away from areas where he operated, creating dead zones in the city's maintenance budget. The evidence was damning, establishing a direct link between his administrative decisions and the success of his criminal career. It was a revelation of corruption so complete that it fundamentally changed the prosecution's theory of the case, elevating it to an indictment against the city's governing structures themselves. As the summer transition approached, the excavation teams discovered the final, largest burial site, a decommissioned sanitation plant on the outskirts of the city that Vance had once helped manage. The scale of the discovery at this site was unprecedented, requiring a massive, multi-agency operation that involved federal resources and specialized engineering teams. The site had been modified with a level of sophistication that suggested Vance had planned for the possibility of discovery long before he was ever caught. He had buried his victims within the structural foundations of the facility, ensuring that the only way to reach them was to dismantle the very infrastructure he had been responsible for building. This final discovery served as the ultimate, chilling statement on his life's work. He had literally woven his violence into the foundations of the city, using his public duties as the physical anchor for his private horrors. The Sterling family, who had become the public faces of this reckoning, visited the site of the final discovery, their presence a moment of profound, quiet strength. They didn't speak to the cameras, but their stance, their solidarity, and their refusal to look away served as a silent, powerful demand for closure. Their journey from the initial, hopeful search in 2002 to the systematic, agonizing recovery of 2026 was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. They had become the anchor for a city in the midst of a massive, painful structural reset. Their presence also served to keep the focus on the victims, ensuring that the trial didn't become a purely intellectual or technical exercise, but remained a story of human loss, human persistence, and the search for a justice that could finally bring the ghosts to rest. The media coverage, which had initially been sensationalist, began to take on a more somber, investigative tone. Reporters and documentarians were now looking beyond the crime to the broader implications of Vance's actions. The diary entries were being read by experts in sociology and urban studies, who used them to illustrate the way that social and administrative neglect can create the conditions for predatory behavior to flourish. The Vance case had become a focal point for a national conversation about the responsibility of municipal government to the most vulnerable members of society. The industrial heart of Detroit, once the site of a forgotten nightmare, was now being viewed as a catalyst for a rebirth, a place where the past could be acknowledged, the victims could be honored, and the future could be built on a foundation of transparency and accountability rather than concealment and decay. The investigation was now entering its terminal phase, the forensic teams having covered every inch of the sites indicated by the diary and the radar results. The inventory of the recovered victims had reached 12, a number that sat heavy in the hearts of the Detroit community. The trial team, satisfied that they had a comprehensive and unassailable case, turned their focus back to the courtroom, where the final legal battles over the admissibility of the diary and the technical interpretations of the city's administrative history were beginning. The atmosphere was one of quiet, disciplined anticipation. The city had endured the excavation, the news, the grief, and the reckoning. It was now preparing for the ultimate, final act of the process, the presentation of the case to a jury of its peers, the formal acknowledgement of the truth that had been so cruelly and so deliberately obscured for nearly 25 years. As the forensic equipment was packed away and the sites were returned to the city for future development, the feeling of resolution was unmistakable. The process had been slow, often agonizing, and deeply invasive, but it had been the only way to ensure that the ghost of Arthur Vance would be fully excised from the city's memory. The diary had served its purpose, having guided the truth out of the basement and into the light, and now it was left to the legal system to complete the task. The investigative team, their mission accomplished, began the long process of transitioning back to their regular duties, but they would forever be marked by the months they spent in the industrial shadows of Detroit. They had learned the depth of human darkness, the power of a single document to destroy a life, and the persistent, unyielding nature of the truth. The long, industrial winter was over, the ice had thawed, and the city was ready, finally, to begin the long-delayed and much-needed process of turning the page. The transition from the excavation sites to the courtroom was a shift from the physical reconstruction of tragedy to the intellectual and legal demolition of a monster. As the final forensic reports were compiled, the city of Detroit stood at a precarious crossroads, where the collective trauma of the past was being funneled into the narrow, formal conduit of the judicial system. The sheer weight of the evidence, 12 identified victims, thousands of pages of annotated municipal records, and the fragile, devastating testament of the Martha Vance diary created a legal record so voluminous that it required the creation of a temporary court facility just to manage the flow of exhibits. This was no longer just a trial. It was a societal accounting, a meticulously orchestrated performance of accountability that sought to balance the scales of justice for decades of unchecked predation. The defense team, now operating in a landscape where their client's professional and personal life had been shredded, had shifted their strategy toward the only thing left, the constitutional integrity of the evidence. They fought the diary, claiming it was an inadmissible hearsay narrative, a desperate attempt to sever the link between Arthur Vance's administrative decisions and his physical violence. Inside the sterile, high-security courtroom, the atmosphere was one of breathless, sustained tension. The presiding judge, known for a temperament that allowed no deviation from the procedural strictness of the law, ran the proceedings with the precision of a clock. Every day, the courtroom filled to capacity with the families of the victims, their presence a silent, immovable reminder of the stakes. The district attorney's opening argument was a masterful synthesis of the forensic and the administrative, weaving the cold facts of the burials with the systemic coldness of Vance's career. She painted a picture of a man who viewed the city as his personal laboratory, a place where he could exert control over not just the life and death of individuals, but over the physical environment itself. The diary was introduced not as a mere collection of thoughts, but as a deliberate, itemized log of the cost of that control. When the first pages were projected onto the giant courtroom screens, the sight of Martha's cramped, agitated handwriting, the frantic, desperate documentation of a woman living in the epicenter of a nightmare, was enough to bring even the most hardened bailiffs to a pause. The prosecution's strategy hinged on the doctrine of intent, arguing that Vance's professional actions, his constant rerouting of resources, his intentional degradation of public safety infrastructure, were not acts of negligence, but acts of premeditation. To prove this, they brought in city planning experts who systematically deconstructed Vance's work history, demonstrating that the anomalies in his projects were statistically impossible to attribute to mere incompetence. Every time Vance had diverted funds from lighting installations, it had directly correlated with an uptick in disappearances in that sector. The jury, a group of ordinary citizens who had been brought into this singular, dark reality, sat with their eyes glued to the evidence, their faces showing the slow, creeping realization of the monster they were observing. They were no longer seeing a retired official, they were seeing an architect of isolation. The defense's attempt to dismiss these correlations as administrative quirks failed to gain traction, as the prosecutor linked them, time and again, to the exact dates documented in Martha's diary. The most electrifying moment of the trial occurred when the lead investigator, a man whose face had become a fixture in the Detroit media, took the stand to testify about the diary's discovery. He recounted the moment of opening the Dropbox, the feeling of the brittle, aged paper, and the subsequent days of breathless verification. He spoke of the basement, the smell, the physical evidence, and the, at times, nauseating sense of being in the presence of a history that had finally been forced into the light. As he described the recovery of the 12th victim, the courtroom fell into a silence, so profound it felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. The lead investigator's voice, steady and devoid of unnecessary theatrics, carried the weight of the years spent in pursuit of the case. When the defense tried to cross-examine him on the possibility of a third-party tampering with the diary, the investigator's response was immediate and devastating. He cited the microscopic fiber evidence, the digital forensics of the ink, and the overlapping, indelible records of the municipal documents that had validated the diary's claims long before the pages were even read. Arthur Vance, throughout these testimonies, remained the primary object of observation. His response to the unfolding prosecution was a masterclass in psychological dissociation. He watched the projections of his life, the evidence of his violence, and the testimony of his victims' families with a look of clinical, detached curiosity, as if he were observing a minor traffic case rather than a trial that would result in his lifelong isolation. Occasionally, he would lean over to his defense counsel and whisper something that would draw a frantic, frustrated headshake in response. These moments, captured by the high-definition cameras in the courtroom, were transmitted to the world, cementing his reputation as a predator who lacked even the most rudimentary capacity for remorse. The public's fury at this display was a tangible force. It fueled the protests outside the building, the editorials, and the incessant, intense public discourse that dominated every corner of Detroit life during those long, midsummer months. As the trial reached the halfway mark, the prosecution began the focus on the victims themselves. They were no longer just names on a recovered barrel. They were individuals whose lives had been interrupted. One by one, family members took the stand to describe the missing, the empty seats at tables, the missed graduations, and the decades of wondering. The prosecution's goal was clear: to ensure that the jury could never forget the human reality that existed beneath the cold, industrial abstractions of Vance's work. The family's testimony was not a performance. It was an act of raw, human resistance. Every story was a sharp, clear rebuke to Vance's attempt to treat these lives as variables in an equation. The jury, who had been listening to the technical complexities of city zoning and soil forensics, were suddenly grounded in the visceral, undeniable nature of the loss. The tone of the courtroom changed, becoming less like a debate over evidence and more like a space where the truth was being reclaimed piece by piece. The defense, recognizing that their strategy of technical obfuscation was failing, attempted a desperate pivot to the diminished capacity defense, arguing that Vance's decades-long behavior was indicative of a pathological, uncontrollable compulsion rather than calculated malice. They brought in a psychiatrist who had interviewed Vance in detention, claiming that the diary itself was proof of a man who had been living in a dissociated, reality-distorted state. The prosecution's response was swift and brutal. They called their own expert witness, a neurologist who had analyzed Vance's career-long decision-making patterns, showing that the planning required to maintain his professional status and his predatory lifestyle simultaneously required a level of executive functioning that was completely inconsistent with the defense's claims of diminished capacity. The prosecution essentially argued that Vance was not a man who had lost his way. He was a man who had built a map of his own making, and the trial was the process of finally holding him accountable for every step he had taken upon it. During the final weeks of the trial, the sense of urgency in Detroit hit a fever pitch. The city was physically and emotionally exhausted, but the commitment to the process remained unshaken. The case had become the singular focus of the metropolitan identity. Everywhere one went, from the shops downtown to the quiet suburban streets, the trial was the heartbeat of the conversation. People were reading the published transcripts, debating the forensic methodology, and sharing the weight of the collective memory that was being exhumed in real time. The court of public opinion was running parallel to the formal trial, and it was reaching a point of absolute, near-universal consensus. There was no longer a question of if Vance would be found guilty, but rather of how the city would move forward once the final, ultimate verdict had been delivered. As the judge announced the final day for closing arguments, the city of Detroit braced itself. The courtroom, the news vans, and the thousands of people gathered outside were all participating in a rare, historic moment where the legal machinery of the state was finally aligning with the truth that the public had been seeking for 24 years. The diary, sitting in its secure evidence case at the heart of the courtroom, seemed to hold a charge all its own, a small, fragile object that had survived the neglect, the secrets, and the violence to become the most powerful instrument of justice the city had ever known. The final arguments were a summation of the case's essence. The prosecution was arguing for the sanctity of the truth, while the defense was arguing for the necessity of the doubt. The verdict was coming, the end of the long, industrial winter was in sight, and the city was ready to close the file on a monster who had tried to build his existence on the foundation of the shadows he created. The atmosphere in the gallery during these final days was one of solemn, heavy focus. The jury, tasked with a final decision, showed no signs of distraction. They were locked into the narrative, processing the layers of administrative corruption, forensic evidence, and human testimony with a level of attention that spoke to their own sense of duty. The city was watching, the world was watching, and the families were watching, waiting for the final, necessary validation of the justice they had been promised. The trial was the culmination of an odyssey that had started with a vanished girl on a winter night in 2002, and it was about to reach its final, inevitable destination, the courtroom of history, where the truth of Arthur Vance's life would be inscribed in a verdict that could never be overturned, never be ignored, and never be forgotten. The long, industrial winter was finally ending, and the air was beginning to clear, replaced by the cool, sharp reality of a justice that had taken 24 years to arrive, but had arrived with the force of an absolute and undeniable truth. The final arguments in the trial of Arthur Vance were less a debate and more a formal reading of a death sentence for a life built on shadows. The district attorney stood before the jury, her movements deliberate, her voice echoing in the cavernous silence of the courtroom. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She laid out the timeline of the 2002 disappearance of Chloe Sterling not as an isolated tragedy, but as the inaugural act of a predatory symphony. She mapped the industrial sites, the diverted lighting budgets, and the precise, cold entries in the diary, painting a portrait of a man who treated Detroit not as a home, but as a map for his own dark appetites. When she finished, the courtroom felt drained, as if the oxygen had been pulled out to make room for the weight of the facts now sitting heavy on the jurors' consciences. The defense, for their part, offered a closing statement that felt like a whisper in a thunderstorm. They spoke of the burden of proof, the sanctity of doubt, and the fallibility of interpretation, but the air was gone from their sails. They were fighting a history that had been physically unearthed, a reality that had been documented in the victim's own handwriting, and a city that was looking on with a unified demand for a reckoning. The jury's deliberation, which many expected to stretch into days, lasted less than 5 hours. The speed of their decision was a testament to the sheer, overwhelming mass of evidence that had been presented. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, the courtroom was so quiet that the sound of a distant ambulance siren outside seemed to pierce the walls.
Guilty.
Guilty on 12 counts of capital murder. Guilty of the systematic kidnapping and death of Chloe Sterling. Guilty of conspiracy and administrative corruption. As each count was read, Arthur Vance did not react. He stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of impenetrable, sociopathic cool. The gallery, however, erupted, not into cheers, but into a low, rumbling surge of emotion. Mothers who had waited for 2 decades sobbed openly. Fathers who had spent years in the shadows of grief finally looked up, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a marathon that had finally reached its end. The judge had to call for order 3 times, her voice cutting through the thick, emotional haze that had settled over the chamber. The sentencing phase, which followed immediately, was a process of catharsis. The judge allowed the victim impact statements to continue, but this time, the focus was on the future. One after another, the families of the victims stood up, their voices no longer shaking with the fear of the unknown, but with the steady, piercing strength of the found. They spoke of the lives that had been stolen, not just the individuals, but the futures, the grandchildren, the moments of joy that had been extinguished in the cold, industrial dark of Detroit. They looked directly at Arthur Vance, and for the first time, he seemed to shift. He didn't look back, but his posture sagged, the arrogance of his demeanor finally collapsing under the sheer weight of the collective human truth being spoken at him. He was a man who had thought he had erased his victims, but here they were, their names being called out, their stories being told, their humanity being restored in the very chamber where he had sought to hide. The judge, before delivering the final sentence, addressed the gallery, her words serving as a coda for the entire city. She spoke of the failures of the institution, the systemic blindness that had allowed such a predator to operate, and the necessity of using this tragedy to build a city that would never again prioritize the cold, administrative bottom line over the lives of its most vulnerable citizens. She looked at Vance, who was now staring at the floor, and in a voice that was both icy and resolute, she sentenced him to 12 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There would be no sunlight for him, no freedom, no control. He was to be removed from the society he had tried to dismantle and cast into a cage, where the only thing he would have to look at for the remainder of his life would be the emptiness of the walls he had finally, irrevocably built around himself. As the bailiffs moved in to chain him, the room remained in a state of suspended animation. The transition from the courtroom to the holding facility was a blur of movement. The flash of cameras, the shouting of journalists, the surge of the crowd. Outside, the city of Detroit was already undergoing a transformation. The news of the verdict had hit the streets like an electric current. People were pouring out of their homes, gathering in the public squares, and filling the memorial sites that had been established at the excavation locations. The fear that had defined the winter of 2002 was finally being replaced by a sober, reflective sense of justice. The city was finally beginning to grieve, properly and openly, and the process of rebuilding the social fabric was already underway. The trial had been the final piece of the forensic excavation, the formal procedure required to bury the past, and now, the city could finally look at the ground beneath its feet without the terror of what might be lying beneath. In the aftermath, the Sterling family returned to the site of the former brick home, which had since been cleared and was awaiting its transformation into a community park. Standing there, amidst the quiet, late summer grass, they finally felt the arrival of the peace they had spent 24 years pursuing. They talked about Chloe, not as the victim of the case, but as the vibrant, brilliant daughter who had loved books, who had dreamt of architecture, and who had been the heart of their home. The diary, which had been the catalyst for everything, was discussed in a different light. It was no longer the centerpiece of a criminal investigation. It was seen as the final, desperate act of a woman who had been trapped in a cage of her own making, a woman who had, in the end, chosen to be the instrument of her husband's downfall. The family expressed a strange, conflicted pity for Martha, recognizing that she, too, had been a victim of Arthur's predatory nature, A victim who had eventually found the strength to break the silence, even if it took her until the final days of her life to do so. The task force members, who had spent their careers chasing the phantom, found themselves in a strange, quiet place. They had achieved the pinnacle of investigative success, the resolution of a notorious cold case, the conviction of a prolific serial predator, and the restoration of a city's history. Yet, the victory felt heavy. The recovery of the 12 victims and the systematic destruction of Arthur Vance's life had been a process of digging through the worst parts of human existence. They sat in their offices, the file boxes packed and ready for the archives, and looked at each other with the quiet understanding of people who had stared into the abyss and hadn't blinked. They had done their job, but they were forever marked by the details they had unearthed, the stories they had helped to finish, and the responsibility they had felt for the families who had been waiting for them to arrive. The media coverage, which had been a constant, deafening roar throughout the trial, finally began to recede, leaving behind a silence that allowed the city to speak for itself. The documentary crews, the news teams, and the investigative writers packed their bags and departed, leaving the streets of Detroit to the people who actually lived there. The city began to reclaim its own story, moving the narrative away from the sensationalism of the I-5 killer and toward a narrative of local resilience, municipal reform, and the power of a community that had refused to give up on its own. The diary, now safely housed in the city archives, became the subject of quiet, respectful interest. It was no longer a weapon to be wielded in a trial. It was a piece of history, a reminder of the fragility of the peace and the constant vigilance required to protect it. The final, physical act of the trial was the sealing of the case files. With the judge's final signature, the investigation into the 2002 disappearance of Chloe Sterling was officially, legally, and permanently closed. The documentation of the sites, the forensic analysis of the burial grounds, and the transcripts of the courtroom proceedings were all deposited into the state's historical library. They stood as a permanent, searchable monument to the events of the last 2 decades. The archives, quiet and temperature-controlled, provided the final home for the truth that had taken 24 years to surface. It was a place where, in the centuries to come, students of the law, historians of the city, and families of the future could find the account of the winter when the snow turned dark, the spring when the truth was unearthed, and the summer when justice was finally, completely served. As the city turned the page, a new kind of energy began to pulse through its veins. It wasn't just the energy of industrial development or urban renewal. It was the energy of a city that had faced its worst reflection and hadn't turned away. The scars were there, visible in the restored sites, the community safety programs, and the collective memory of the people, but they were no longer a cause for paralysis. They were a cause for continued, intentional growth. The case of Arthur Vance had been a trial by fire, a process that had consumed the city's past and left behind a foundation that was scorched, yes, but also forged in the truth of what had occurred. The long, industrial winter had reached its end. The secrets of the basement were finally silent, and the city was moving with a steady, determined pace into a future that was defined by the light of the truth, rather than the shadows of the past. The final act of the trial concluded. The courtroom was cleaned, the lights were dimmed, and the building returned to its quiet, municipal existence. But the impression of the events remained. The city had changed, the legal system had been refined, and the families had found their peace. The diary, the central instrument of this entire transition, remained as the ultimate testament to the idea that silence, however long it lasts, is never absolute. Truth, even when buried in concrete, even when hidden by snow, even when cloaked in the administrative routines of a lifetime, will find a way to speak. The long, industrial winter of the Detroit cold case was over, and the truth, in all its devastating, human, and final glory, was the only thing left standing in the light of the morning. The echoes of the courtroom had not even begun to fade before the city of Detroit embarked on the arduous task of translating the verdict into a long-term blueprint for civic renewal. The conviction of Arthur Vance was not an end. It was the starting gun for a systemic audit of every department that had, through negligence or corruption, allowed a predator to manipulate the infrastructure of a metropolis for his own macabre ends. For the municipal government, the trial had exposed a rot that went deeper than the actions of a single man. It revealed a culture of siloed bureaucracy, where information regarding public safety and urban maintenance rarely crossed departmental lines. As the new city administration began its work in the late summer of 2026, the focus shifted from the courtroom to the cold, analytical reality of municipal policy. The Vance Mandate, as it was dubbed by the press, became a legislative imperative to overhaul city management, requiring total transparency in zoning, infrastructure spending, and public works projects, the very areas Vance had used to engineer his isolated hunting grounds. At the center of this reform were the families of the victims, who had transformed from passive witnesses to the trial into active agents of political change. They refused to fade back into the private sphere, instead establishing the Sterling Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to tracking the development of the city's industrial sectors and ensuring that no zone was ever again permitted to become a dark sector. Their presence in the city council meetings was a constant, steadying force, a reminder to the politicians of the cost of institutional apathy. The foundation worked closely with the police department to develop the Safety Grid Initiative, a sophisticated, citizen-led patrol system that integrated modern surveillance technology with traditional, high-visibility community engagement. It was a model of collaborative governance that sought to eliminate the shadows where Vance had operated, turning the very areas that had been scenes of tragedy into hubs of community activity, light, and transparency. The psychological landscape of the survivors continued to undergo its own quiet, private metamorphosis. For the families, the closure of the trial meant that the name Chloe Sterling and the other 11 victims were finally reclaimed from the tabloid sensationalism that had threatened to obscure their humanity for over 2 decades. In the autumn of 2026, a series of commemorative events were held across the city, not to memorialize the murder, but to honor the lives that had been interrupted. There were music concerts in the parks where the burial sites had been cleared, public readings of literature, and the dedication of a series of educational scholarships funded by the city, specifically targeting students who lived in the neighborhoods most neglected during the Vance years. This was an act of reclamation. The city was taking the ground that had been used to hide the violence and was, quite literally, nurturing the growth of the next generation upon it. Within the walls of Pelican Bay, Arthur Vance existed in a state of absolute, sensory-deprived suspension. Having been denied any meaningful interaction with the outside world, he was now an entity of pure memory, a man whose only reality was the sequence of his own past actions. Prison psychologists noted that he spent his days in a cycle of intellectual rigidity, mentally remapping the city's streets and industrial zones as they existed in the early 2000s, still obsessed with the mechanics of his own predatory success. Yet, the walls of his cell were increasingly closing in. The media reports of the city's reform, the news of the Sterling Foundation's success, and the public rejection of everything he had represented leaked into his isolation like a slow-acting poison. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of power, and he was now forced to live in a reality where that power had been not only dismantled but ridiculed. He was an irrelevance, a relic of a darker era, watching from the inside as the city he had tried to break began to heal itself in ways he could never have conceived. The mystery of Julian Vance, the twin brother who had been forced to share the genetic architecture of a monster, remained an enduring, poignant footnote. In the months after the verdict, reports surfaced that he had quietly relocated to a remote coastal town in the Pacific Northwest, where he had reportedly changed his name and begun a new life as a craftsman. He had succeeded in the one thing Arthur never could. He had reclaimed his own agency. The fact that he was no longer the face of the monster in the eyes of the public was the final triumph for a man who had been a casualty of his own biology. His journey was a powerful, silent testament to the resilience of the individual in the face of the most impossible, external circumstances. While Arthur Vance ended his life in the dark of a maximum security prison, Julian Vance had chosen the light of a life that belonged solely to him, proving that identity is not a genetic destiny, but a lifelong project of choice. As the months of 2026 ground on, the investigation into the Vance sites was officially declared complete. The recovery teams, having performed a meticulous, inch-by-inch search of every sector identified by the radar and the diary, presented their final inventory to the state attorney general. The final count of 12 was definitive. The work was finished. The detectives, who had spent years in the industrial shadows, finally began the long process of transitioning back to their regular duties. For many, this was a difficult, nearly impossible task. They had been exposed to a depth of human depravity that few ever have to experience, and they carried that knowledge with them like a weight. They gathered for a final, unofficial dinner, a group of people who had been forged by the shared intensity of their mission, and they talked, not about the trial, or the evidence, or the courtroom, but about the future. They talked about their families, their hobbies, and the simple, ordinary things of life that they had neglected while pursuing a phantom through the cold Detroit winters. The diary, the central instrument of this entire transition, remained the focus of intense academic and forensic study. It was archived in the Michigan State Historical Library, kept in a specialized, temperature-controlled environment where researchers could examine the pages using non-destructive light technology. It was no longer a piece of criminal evidence to be used in a courtroom. It was a primary historical document, a key to understanding the sociology of power, isolation, and the mechanics of evil in the 21st century. Scholars were increasingly drawn to the diary as a work of psychological literature, an accidental, harrowing autobiography of a woman who had become the silent, horrified chronicler of her own ruin. It was a document that would continue to be studied for generations, a touchstone for the way that memory, guilt, and the passage of time could converge to reveal the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried. As the final report on the Vance case was deposited into the state's archives, the sentiment in the streets of Detroit was one of profound, settled peace. The city had changed, the legal system had been refined, and the survivors had found their way into a life that was finally, unequivocally theirs. The phantom of the I-5 corridor, the monster of the basement, the architect of the shadows, all these names were now part of a history that was safely behind glass. The city was finally able to breathe. The long, agonizing night that had begun with the disappearance of Chloe Sterling had finally, definitively given way to the light of a new, clear, and enduring day. The archives were sealed, the records were finalized, and the long, slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the legal process had finally finished its work. The phantom was gone, the shadows had been dispersed, and the quiet, industrial streets of Detroit could finally exist without the unspoken, terrifying question that had hung over them for so long. The impact of the trial on the American legal system was also beginning to crystallize. The successful synthesis of forensic genealogy, historical municipal auditing, and the recovery of long-term archival evidence established a new, high-water mark for cold case investigation. State legislatures across the country began drafting the Vance Protocols, a series of legislative reforms that prioritized the preservation of municipal records as critical criminal evidence and mandated the cross-referencing of administrative projects with criminal activity reports. The trial had forced the system to evolve, showing that the resolution of a cold case required not just the tools of modern technology, but the persistence of a system that was willing to acknowledge its own past failures. It was a legacy of accountability that would protect the citizens of the future, ensuring that the gaps in the system where predators once thrived would be, one by one, permanently closed. As the sun set over the Detroit River on the final day of the year, the feeling was not one of lingering trauma, but of a quiet, hard-won victory. The city was moving, with a steady, determined pace, into a future that was defined by the light of the truth, rather than the shadows of the past. The archives were full, the stories had been told, and the names of the 12 victims were finally, irrevocably etched into the historical record. The long, industrial winter was over, the ice had thawed, and the city was ready, finally, to begin the long-delayed and much-needed process of turning the page. The case of Arthur Vance was concluded, a long, complex, and devastating chapter that had been fully, finally, and irrevocably closed, leaving in its wake a city that was forever changed, forever marked, and Most importantly, forever watchful. The truth, in all its devastating, human, and final glory, was the only thing left standing in the light of the morning. The finality of the Vance case, now settled into the bedrock of American criminal history, cast a long, cooling shadow over the investigative landscape of the late 2020s. By the autumn of 2026, the fervor that had once gripped the nation, the obsessive analysis of somatic mutation mapping, the daily vigils outside the Detroit courthouse, the relentless media dissection of the administrative corruption that had shielded Arthur Vance for decades, had dissipated into a state of somber, scholarly reflection. The trial had not just been a judicial proceeding. It had functioned as a grand, necessary purging of a systemic failure that had allowed a predator to harvest lives across the Michigan industrial wilderness for nearly a quarter-century. As the public interest waned, the true, lasting significance of the resolution began to emerge not in the sensationalist headlines of the past, but in the quiet, structural changes to the way society perceived the boundaries of the cold case category. For the forensic community, the Detroit case became the cornerstone of a new, global ethical framework regarding the use of private, historical documents as investigative evidence. The debate that had flared during the trial, concerning the intersection of private property, the sanctity of personal records, and the necessity of cold case resolution, had resulted in the passage of the Documentation Integrity Act of 2026. This legislation provided a rigorous, transparent structure for how state and federal agencies could utilize historical diaries, letters, and personal effects found at crime scenes to solve cold cases, ensuring that the next generation of detectives would have the tools they needed without compromising the fundamental rights of the public. It was a compromise born of the Vance case's unique complexities, turning the technical and moral nightmare of interpreting Martha Vance's diaries into a template for ethical, high-precision forensic work that would define the decades to come. The landscape of Detroit's neglected industrial sectors, once the silent, complicit backdrops to Arthur Vance's dark methodology, began to heal as well. The Sterling Memorial Park, established on the site of the former brick home and extending into the adjacent rehabilitated industrial lot, became a place of genuine public life, not just a hollow site of mourning. Park rangers and local community leaders transformed these areas into educational centers where youth programs focused on urban history, environmental stewardship, and the ethics of civic governance. By reclaiming these spaces, the community was essentially performing a symbolic eviction of the ghost that had once possessed them. The very geography of the Detroit Eastern Corridor, which had been the literal map of a killer's movements, was repurposed. It became the artery of a new, hypervigilant culture of public safety where satellite-linked emergency nodes, advanced environmental sensors, and integrated community policing created a multi-layered security grid that left no square inch of the city truly isolated. In the sterile, fluorescent corridors of the Pelican Bay State Prison, the entity known as Arthur Vance had essentially ceased to exist as a human participant in the world. He remained an enigma, a man who had successfully compartmentalized his past so deeply that he existed in a permanent state of psychological stasis. The prison administration, having learned from the early days of his incarceration, effectively reduced him to a non-entity. He was no longer a person in the eyes of his captors. He was a logistical data point, a liability to be managed with minimal interaction and maximum security. The irony of his existence was absolute. The man who had spent his life seeking to control every environment he entered, to command the destinies of others, and to hide in plain sight, had achieved his final, ultimate form, complete and utter irrelevance. He was a prisoner not just of the state, but of the very walls he had built around his own humanity. His life was a slow, entropic fade, a biological process stripped of all meaning, ambition, or impact, a fitting end for a predator who had valued nothing but the cold, clinical pursuit of his own dark impulses. The families of the victims, though no longer bound by the rigid, grueling schedule of a trial, found that the conclusion of the legal process was not an end, but a transition into a different, more sustainable kind of mourning. Many joined forces to form a national support network for the families of unsolved crime victims, Using the spotlight, they had been forced into to lobby for better resources for cold case investigators and more robust protections for the families of the missing. They had traveled through the darkest, most isolated sectors of the human experience, and they had emerged with a collective voice that was now impossible for the state to ignore. Their work ensured that the memory of the missing would not be left to the mercy of aging paper files or forgotten digital archives. They were the true architects of the legacy of the Vance trial, turning a story of calculated, industrial-scale murder into a story of persistent, unyielding advocacy. In the academic world, the case of the Detroit Phantom became the subject of extensive, multidisciplinary research. Historians, sociologists, and behavioral scientists flocked to the archives, attempting to reconcile the horrifying reality of Arthur Vance's life with the broader cultural context of the early 21st century. The question remained, how does a predator operate undetected in a society that prides itself on connectivity and surveillance? The answer, as the trial had demonstrated, was not in the failure of the technology, but in the failure of the connection. Arthur Vance had exploited the gaps in the system, the moments where local police departments did not share information, where municipal infrastructure was managed in a vacuum, and where the mundane, respectable facade of a suburban professional was considered an impenetrable fact of life. The study of the case became a primer on the vulnerability of a decentralized society, a cautionary tale that warned of the hidden, predatory monsters who could survive in the friction between institutions. As the decade of the 2020s drew to a close, the history of the Vance case began to crystallize into the definitive record. Historians and true crime documentarians produced exhaustive, balanced accounts of the events, stripping away the tabloid sensationalism to focus on the procedural, the forensic, and the human realities of the nearly 25-year saga. These final works, authorized by the state and the victims' families, served as the definitive, final word. They detailed the evolution of the technology, the failures of the early investigations, and the ultimate, inevitable collision between a carefully constructed life of deception and the relentless, advancing wave of scientific and investigative truth. It was a narrative that felt almost like a myth, the story of a phantom who had ruled the darkness until the light of the 21st century finally reached into the shadows to drag him into the sun. The final legacy of the case was a quiet, profound transformation in the concept of justice. It was no longer viewed as a static, binary event, a simple arrest or a guilty verdict, but as a long, arduous process of restoration. The case of the Detroit Phantom had taught the public that justice requires not only the capture of the guilty, but the restoration of the names of the victims, the acknowledgement of the survivors, and the constant, vigilant improvement of the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. It was a victory of the persistent over the evasive, of the collective over the individual, and of the truth over the convenient lie. As the sun set over the Detroit River on a quiet summer evening in 2026, the landscape seemed to finally hold a peace that it had been denied for decades. The names of the 12 women were no longer whispers in the dark. They were part of the state's heritage, protected by the vigilance of a society that had learned, at a tremendous, life-altering cost, to see the monster before he could strike. The long, agonizing night had ended, and in its place stood a clear, enduring dawn, defined by the unwavering light of a truth that could never again be hidden, erased, or forgotten. The investigation's archives, now neatly bound and stored in the Detroit Historical Museum, provided a final closure. For the researchers and the curious who walked through those halls, the case was a somber reminder that the city of Detroit was not defined by the actions of a single man, but by the strength of the community that had risen to meet the challenge. The city had looked into the basement, had read the diary, had unearthed the truth, and had emerged with a new clarity of purpose. The long, industrial winter had reached its conclusion, and the city was moving forward into a future where the shadows would be illuminated, the secrets would be kept no longer, and the memory of the lost would be held in the light of an enduring, collective truth. The cold case was not just solved, it had been integrated into the history of a city that was, finally, whole, watchful, and at peace. The resolution of the Detroit cold case, a saga that had spanned nearly a quarter century, did more than just secure a conviction. It fundamentally altered the DNA of urban administration and public safety protocols across the American Midwest. As the year 2026 reached its twilight, the administrative reforms birthed from the Vance Mandate began to yield tangible, life-saving results. Detroit had moved from being a city where bureaucratic neglect created opportunities for violence to a city where the integration of data, transparency, and civic vigilance acted as a shield for its most vulnerable populations. The legacy of the trial was reflected in the thousands of smart lights installed in formerly desolate corridors, the real-time public access to municipal zoning and infrastructure maintenance logs, and a police force that had transitioned from a reactive, overwhelmed agency into a proactive, data-driven entity. The city had effectively engineered the shadows out of its own landscape, ensuring that no future Arthur Vance would ever have the architectural cover necessary to conduct a predatory campaign in the dark. For the forensic and legal communities, the Vance case remained a point of permanent study, a touchstone that continued to influence investigative methodologies well beyond the borders of Michigan. The sheer volume of evidence, the synthesis of Martha Vance's handwritten diary with the cold, immutable data of municipal blueprints, remained a landmark achievement in forensic detective work. It served as a reminder that the truth often resides not in the high-tech, futuristic tools of the present, but in the mundane, overlooked records of the past. The case had proved that a dedicated, interdisciplinary team, armed with the patience to cross-reference administrative history with criminal data, could bridge the gap of decades. It was a victory for the old-fashioned detective work of documentation, elevated to an art form by the precision of 21st-century forensic analytics. The Vance files were now a staple in law school curricula, teaching students not just the letter of the law, but the ethical and procedural imperative of looking backward to move forward. The survivors of the victims, those who had carried the burden of the unknown for so many years, found that the conclusion of the trial had opened up a space in their lives for a different kind of existence. They were no longer the families of the missing, defined by a void that they had no control over. They had become the architects of the memorial, a group that maintained a quiet, powerful influence on the city's direction. The Sterling Foundation continued to operate, its primary mission having evolved from seeking justice for Chloe to the broader, more ambitious goal of neighborhood revitalizations. They had turned the site of the brick home and the neighboring textile mill into spaces that hosted summer arts programs, public libraries, and community gardens. It was a profound act of transubstantiation. The very earth that had been used to hide the violence was now being used to cultivate the growth of the community, turning the sites of the past into the living spaces of the future. In the quiet of Pelican Bay, the man who had been the architect of this tragedy became an increasingly spectral presence. He lived out his days in a state of absolute, sensory-deprived existence, a man who had successfully stripped his own life of any meaning beyond the walls of his cell. The news of the city's transformation, the parks, the lights, the transparency, reached him only as filtered, distant information, a reality that he could no longer influence and which no longer acknowledged his existence. His transformation into a non-entity was complete. The predator who had once felt he was the master of Detroit's landscape was now entirely consumed by the very architecture of his own imprisonment. He was the ultimate, solitary prisoner of his own past, living in a reality where the world had not only continued without him but had improved because of the reckoning he had inadvertently triggered. The history of the diary itself, the small, leather-bound volume that had been the ultimate instrument of justice, continued to captivate the public imagination. It was kept in a specialized, archival vault in the City Museum, a permanent fixture of the Detroit historical record. Researchers who requested access to the diaries were struck by the fragility of the pages, the erratic, frantic nature of the handwriting, and the sheer, overwhelming weight of the secret that Martha Vance had been forced to hold for 24 years. It was a document that served as a moral compass for the city, a testament to the idea that silence, no matter how long it is maintained, is never truly permanent. The diary had become the city's own black box, the final, honest record of the disaster that had occurred, and its preservation served as a permanent, cautionary reminder of the necessity of speaking the truth, no matter how terrifying that truth might be. As the years passed, the city of Detroit underwent a quiet but profound physical transformation. The neighborhoods that had once been the focus of Vance's engineering, the areas he had stripped of light and resources, were now the most vibrant, well-lit, and well-managed sectors of the city. The integration of modern urban design with a commitment to public safety meant that the dark zones were gone. The city had learned that the safety of its citizens was not an inherent, static state, but a responsibility that required constant, vigilant maintenance. The Vance case had taught them that the gap between the dark, hidden impulses of a single individual and the organized, technological machinery of the state was the most important space in their democracy. It was in that gap that they had finally, at a terrible cost, learned to be more attentive, more connected, and more profoundly committed to the truth. Looking back at the entire arc of the trial, from the initial, desperate search for Chloe Sterling in 2002 to the final, binding resolution of 2026, the progression felt less like a series of disjointed events and more like a necessary, painful evolution. The case had tested the limits of the city's law, its technology, and its capacity for empathy, and in doing so, it had elevated the standards by which it governed itself. The Phantom had been a catalyst for a systemic upgrade, a violent, unwelcome shock that had forced the city of Detroit to evolve into a more resilient, more transparent, and more just version of itself. The cost of this evolution had been the lives of 12 women, a fact that would always remain the central, unanswerable tragedy at the heart of the story. But in the final assessment, the resolution provided the only comfort that justice can offer, the knowledge that the darkness had been named, the perpetrator had been contained, and the truth had been restored to its rightful place. The long, agonizing night that had begun with the disappearance of Chloe Sterling on a winter night in 2002 had finally, decisively given way to the light of a new, clear, and enduring day. The archives were sealed, the records were complete, and the memory of the Phantom was no longer a terror, but a cautionary tale of a time that had passed. The highways were just roads, the factories were just buildings, and the lives of those who remained were moving forward, forever changed but fundamentally intact. The final, absolute satisfaction of the Vance trial lay in the quiet, undeniable reality that the world had moved on, and the monster, despite all his meticulous planning, his administrative shields, and his decades of calculated evasion, had been left behind. The truth was not just a record in a file. It was the reality of a world that had reclaimed itself, a world that was now, finally and rightfully, whole. As the cycle of the seasons turned and the memories of the trial became part of the historical canon, the story of the Detroit Phantom was concluded, a long, complex, and devastating chapter that had been fully, finally, and irrevocably closed. The 10th movement of this long, haunting symphony of justice began with the quiet, deliberate assembly of the jury for the final stages of the trial, a process that felt less like a courtroom procedure and more like the culmination of a 24-year collective trauma. As the jurors filed into their boxes, their expressions were a steady and heavy, weary resolve. They had spent weeks submerged in the dark, cold reality of the evidence, the meticulous diagrams of industrial neglect, the blood-stained ledgers of the city's urban development office, and the fragile, devastating pages of Martha Vance's diary. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. The gallery, packed with families who had lived the longest winters of their lives in the shadow of the unknown, sat with a collective, jagged tension. Arthur Vance, now shorn of the professional veneer he had spent his entire life crafting, sat motionless at the defense table, a hollowed-out figure of absolute, sociopathic detachment. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterwork of forensic synthesis, a narrative that moved with the precision of a clock. The district attorney did not lean into the melodramatic or the histrionic. She spoke with a clinical, terrifying clarity. She traced the arc of Arthur Vance's life, not as a series of random impulses, but as a deliberate, architectural project of cruelty. She projected the city maps onto the screens, highlighting how he had used his position within the municipal government to curate the darkness. She showed the jury the direct, mathematically significant correlation between his career milestones and the disappearances of the 12 women. It was not a theory, it was a blueprint. The jury watched in stunned, paralyzed silence as she laid out the diary entries alongside the city's official maintenance logs, proving, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the man who had been responsible for the city's safety had been the primary agent of its most intimate, brutal destruction. When the defense stood to make their final plea, the lack of conviction was palpable. They were trying to build a fortress out of smoke. They spoke of the lack of a smoking gun in the traditional sense, the lack of eyewitnesses, and the subjective nature of diary entries, arguments that dissolved the moment they were uttered. The jurors didn't look at the defense attorneys, they looked at the evidence. They looked at the concrete, the soil samples, the recovered charms and jewelry that had been meticulously tagged and displayed. The defense's attempt to paint Arthur Vance as a man of diminished capacity felt like an insult to the intelligence of everyone in the room. He wasn't diminished, he was calculated. He wasn't lost, he was exactly where he had intended to be, executing a plan that spanned nearly a quarter of a century. The final words of the defense, a plea for mercy based on the complexity of the human condition, were met with a cold, absolute silence that was the most powerful rejection of their argument possible. The deliberation phase, which many legal analysts had predicted would take days, ended in under 6 hours. When the foreperson of the jury stood, the courtroom seemed to contract. The sound of the paper being handed to the bailiff was the loudest thing in the world. As the verdict was read, count after count of capital murder, conspiracy, and administrative corruption, the room did not erupt into shouts. It erupted into the sound of a city finally exhaling. Mothers who had waited since 2002 to know the fate of their daughters bowed their heads, their shoulders finally dropping as the suffocating weight of the unknown was replaced by the cold, hard certainty of justice. Arthur Vance did not look up. He did not show anger. He did not show fear. He merely sat, a vessel of dead space, while the life he had built on the wreckage of others was officially, legally dismantled. The sentencing hearing, which occurred 2 days later, transformed the courtroom into a space of profound, collective healing. The victim impact statements were not merely legal requirements. They were the final testimonies of lives that had been lived, loved, and stolen. One by one, the families took the stand, their voices gaining in strength as they spoke of their lost ones, the violinists, the students, the future architects, the artists, whose potential had been erased in the cold, industrial dark. They addressed Arthur Vance directly, their eyes locked on his bowed head, ensuring that he heard every name, every story, and every broken heart. It was a reclaiming of the narrative. They were no longer victims of his secret. They were the architects of his public ruin. When the judge finally pronounced the sentence, 12 consecutive terms of life without the possibility of parole, she framed it not as a punishment, but as a permanent, absolute separation of a predator from the society he had tried to dismantle. As the bailiffs led Arthur Vance away for the final time, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from one of catharsis to one of quiet, disciplined resolve. The press, which had swarmed the building for months, found themselves at a loss for words, their usual rhetoric failing to capture the magnitude of what had just occurred. The city of Detroit, watching through live feeds and radio updates, experienced a profound, collective shift. The trial had been the final, necessary excavation of the truth, the procedural purging of a cancer that had been allowed to spread because people were too afraid, or too complicit, to look closely at the shadows. The diary, now safely housed in the evidence room, would soon be transferred to the historical archives, a document that had served its purpose as the primary instrument of justice. In the hours that followed the sentencing, the city began the process of decommissioning the trial infrastructure. The temporary court facility, the extra security, the media cordons, all were stripped away, leaving the city to return to a normalcy that felt, for the first time in 24 years, truly real. The Sterling family, now the focus of a global outpouring of solidarity, held a final, private gathering at the park where the brick home had once stood. They sat in the late summer grass, the air warm and smelling of the turning leaves, and finally allowed themselves to exist in a present that was not defined by the search for the missing. It was a moment of profound, human stillness, a testament to the fact that while the legal system had delivered the verdict, it was the persistent, unyielding love of the survivors that had truly solved the case. The forensic investigators, whose work had spanned nearly 3 years of constant, agonizing inquiry, began to process the end of their mission. They met in a quiet, nondescript downtown office, the file boxes stacked high around them, and for the first time, the subject was not the crime. They spoke of the future, of the reforms to the city planning department, of the new lighting codes, of the ways the Vance mandate would protect the city's youth in the coming decades. They were the silent, professional heroes of the saga, individuals who had stared into the heart of the darkness and had systematically, piece by piece, dismantled it. They recognized, with a sober clarity, that their success was not just a victory for the law, but a triumph of the truth over the convenient, industrial-scale lie that Arthur Vance had engineered. As night fell over the city of Detroit, the industrial sectors that had once been the focus of the forensic radar were now quiet, vibrant, and alive with the bustle of community life. The lights that had been installed in the aftermath of the discovery were burning bright, a constant, glowing deterrent to the kinds of isolation that Vance had once weaponized. The city was finally, irrevocably connected, its streets and alleys no longer the domain of the predator, but the shared, public space of the citizens. The long, industrial winter had reached its conclusion, and the city was moving forward, with a steady, determined pace, into a future that was defined by the light of the truth, rather than the shadows of the past. The case of the Detroit Phantom was concluded, a long, complex, and devastating chapter that had been fully, finally, and irrevocably closed, leaving in its wake a city that was forever changed, forever marked, and, most importantly, forever watchful. The final, silent witness to the entire saga was the very terrain that had held the secrets of the dead for so long. The abandoned factories, the drainage culverts, and the desolate rail yards were no longer the silent, complicit backdrops to a hidden history. They were being repurposed, their structures integrated into the new, transparent urban plan of the city. Nature had been the first to discover the truth, and the forensic process had been the mechanism by which that truth was elevated to the status of legal fact. The cycle of the cold case, which had begun with an act of profound, calculated violation, had concluded with the restoration of order, the identification of the victims, and the final, absolute accounting of the perpetrator. It was a narrative of profound tragedy, yet one that concluded with the rare, necessary, and absolute satisfaction of a long overdue, final, and total justice. The long, agonizing night had ended, and the city of Detroit, once darkened by the shadow of the Phantom, was finally, peacefully, home again. As the decade drew to a close, the final report was archived. The boxes were shelved, the databases were locked, and the memory of the winter of 2002 became a permanent, foundational part of the city's modern lore. The trial of Arthur Vance remained the most significant event in the city's history, not for the horror it revealed, but for the clarity it demanded. It was the moment the city looked at its own reflection, saw the monster hidden in its midst, and decided, in a collective act of will, that it would never again allow the shadows to take hold. The long, industrial winter was over. The ice had thawed, and the truth, in all its devastating, human, and final glory, was the only thing left standing in the light of the morning. Justice, in its cold, precise, and necessary form, had finally been served, and the Phantom had been left in the dark, forever, while the city moved on, into the light. The finality of the Vance trial did not merely signal the closure of a legal docket, it functioned as the definitive end of an era for the city of Detroit. As the autumn of 2026 deepened, the physical landscape of the city, once a map of hidden tragedies, was undergoing a profound, irreversible transformation. The industrial sectors that had once served as the dark, neglected playgrounds for Arthur Vance's predatory impulses were now the sites of a massive urban renewal project. This was not the typical, cosmetic development of the past. It was a deliberate, forensic reconstruction of the environment. Every derelict structure that had once hidden a burial ground was being dismantled, and in their place, The city was installing public parks, community-led light grids, and high-visibility infrastructure. The Sterling Foundation, now an established pillar of the city's civic life, oversaw every phase of this reclamation, ensuring that the ground that had once held the secrets of the dead was now dedicated to the growth and protection of the living. For the survivors, the post-trial period was a paradoxical season of both relief and profound, lingering adjustment. Having spent over 2 decades in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the truth to surface, they were now forced to confront the reality of a world that had moved on without them. The Sterling Network provided the necessary architecture for this adjustment, offering a community where the grief was not a mark of weakness, but a shared, historical understanding. These individuals had become the moral authorities of the city, their voices carrying the weight of those who had been stolen. They were the ones who ensured that the Vance Mandate remained the primary legislative priority for the municipal government, keeping the pressure on the city administration to never again revert to the bureaucratic complacency that had defined the late 90s and early 2000s. Inside the high-security confines of the Pelican Bay Correctional Facility, Arthur Vance had become a ghost in a machine. The prison administration, following the intense scrutiny of the trial and the subsequent public demand for his complete erasure from the social discourse, had moved him to a specialized wing of permanent, solitary confinement. He was no longer a person of interest, no longer a subject for behavioral study, and no longer an individual with any agency whatsoever. His days were reduced to a series of unvarying, mechanical routines that mirrored the precision of the life he had once constructed for himself in Detroit, yet now, that precision served only to emphasize the absolute, hollow sterility of his existence. He was a man who had sought to define the lives of others through his own cold, predatory logic, only to be defined entirely by the state's absolute control over him. The paradox was complete. The man who had turned Detroit's infrastructure into his weapon was now living out his days in a cage of the state's most perfect, unwavering design. The legacy of the diary, the small, unassuming volume that had triggered the entire reckoning, continued to occupy a central place in the city's cultural identity. It was no longer a secret kept in a basement, nor was it a piece of evidence hidden in a police locker. It was a public artifact, a pedagogical tool for a city that had been forced to learn a lesson in transparency. The archives of the Detroit Historical Museum, which now housed the diary under state-of-the-art conservation standards, saw a steady stream of visitors, students, researchers, and citizens who sought to understand the complexity of the events. Looking at the pages, visitors were often struck by the stark, terrifying mundanity of the entries. It wasn't just a record of horror. It was a record of a marriage, a record of a domestic life, and a record of the slow, grinding erosion of a human soul under the pressure of proximity to an absolute monster. It served as a permanent reminder that evil does not always announce itself with a roar. Often, it whispers from the kitchen table, it hides in the routine of the workday, and it persists in the silence of those who are too afraid to speak. As the city of Detroit prepared for the final, concluding months of 2026, a sense of collective maturity began to settle over the population. The trial had forced the city to look into the mirror, to see the rot that had been allowed to fester, and to decide, as a collective entity, that the past would not define the future. The reconstruction of the industrial corridors was the physical proof of this maturity. By dismantling the structures that had enabled the predatory behavior, the city was not just removing the buildings, it was removing the conditions for the behavior itself. It was an act of architectural and political defiance. Detroit was proving that it was possible to take a space of profound tragedy and transform it into a space of potential, provided that the city was willing to be honest about its own failures. This was the true, lasting victory of the Vance case. The city hadn't just solved a crime, it had healed a systemic wound. The forensic teams, having concluded the long, industrial excavation, officially disbanded, yet the bonds they had formed during the mission remained. They held monthly meetings, not to discuss the case, but to talk about the future of public safety. They were a group of professionals who had been irrevocably altered by their work, and they carried that experience into every new challenge they faced. They had become the guardians of a new philosophy of investigation, one that emphasized the importance of historical records and the vital necessity of interdepartmental collaboration. They were the ones who had shown the world that no secret, no matter how carefully engineered, is capable of surviving the relentless, persistent application of human intelligence and the truth. In the quiet, residential neighborhoods of Detroit, a new generation was growing up with a different relationship to the city's industrial past. For these children, the story of the I-5 Phantom was not a lived, ambient terror, but a historical fact, a dark chapter that was safely contained within the pages of the city's archives. They played in parks that were well-lit. They walked to school on routes that were monitored by modern, transparent technology, and they were raised with an education that emphasized the importance of civic vigilance. They were the beneficiaries of the long, industrial winter that their parents had endured, the ones who would grow up in a city that was defined not by what it had hidden, but by what it had finally